Hey everyone, tonight we journey into the ancient world where gods walked among mortals and wisdom flowed from divine lips. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy these deep explorations of history's mysteries. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see our global community gathering for these nocturnal journeys into the past. Now dim the lights, maybe grab something warm to drink, and let's ease into tonight's story together. We're heading back to the very dawn of civilization itself, to a time when humanity was still learning the basics of existence, when writing was a magical gift, when cities were just beginning to rise from the marshland mud of southern Mesopotamia. This is the story of the seven sages, the Apkallu, beings who, according to ancient Sumerian texts, descended from the cosmic waters to teach humankind everything they would need to build civilization from nothing. The tablets that tell their story were written in cuneiform, pressed into clay by scribes who believed they were recording sacred truth. These weren't myths in the sense of pleasant stories told around fires. To the ancient Mesopotamians, these were historical records, chronicles of actual events that had shaped their world. The seven sages existed before the great flood that nearly destroyed humanity, operating in that impossibly ancient time when the world was young and gods still intervened directly in human affairs. Imagine standing in the ruins of Eridu, the oldest city in the world according to Sumerian tradition, where sand dunes meet ancient foundations and the wind whispers across millennia. Here, archaeologists have uncovered layer upon layer of temples, each built atop the ruins of the one before, stretching back more than 7,000 years. This was the home of Enki, god of wisdom and water, and it was here that the first of the seven sages appeared, emerging from the Absu, the primordial ocean beneath the earth, carrying knowledge that would transform naked, struggling humans into the architects of civilization. The Sumerians called them Abgal in their language, though the Akkadians who came after knew them as Apkallu. Both words meant the same thing: sage, wise one, counselor. But these weren't ordinary advisors. According to the texts, they were semi-divine beings, created by Enki himself in the depths of the cosmic ocean. They possessed intelligence that surpassed human understanding, wisdom granted directly from the god of wisdom. Their purpose was singular and profound, to ensure that humanity would survive and thrive, to lift people from their primitive state and teach them the arts of civilization. The number 7 held deep significance in Mesopotamian thought. It represented completeness, cosmic order, the perfect number. There were 7 heavens, 7 gates to the underworld, 7 winds, 7 planets known to ancient astronomers. The 7 sages fit into this cosmological pattern, each one a channel through which divine knowledge flowed into the human realm. They weren't just teachers in the modern sense. They were initiators, revealers of mysteries, bridges between the divine and mortal worlds. What makes their story particularly fascinating is how precisely the ancient texts record their names and deeds. This wasn't vague mythology. The Uruk list of kings and sages, discovered by German archaeologists in the 1950s and published in 1962, pairs each of the 7 antediluvian sages with the specific king they advised. The tablet bearing the excavation number W20030, 7 now sits in the Baghdad Museum, a tangible link to this ancient tradition. The list starts with Uana, also called Adapa, who served as advisor to Alulim, the very first king to rule in Eridu, when kingship descended from heaven. These weren't distant, aloof figures dwelling in celestial realms. The sages lived among humans, walked the dusty streets of the first cities, participated in daily life even as they transformed it. Ancient reliefs show them in 3 forms: fully anthropomorphic figures dressed in fish-skin cloaks, bird-headed beings with wings, and the most archaic depiction, the fish-man hybrid called Paradu fish in the texts. This last form emphasizes their origin in water, their connection to Enki's realm. They would emerge from the Persian Gulf each morning, the texts say, to instruct humanity, then return to the waters at night. The fish cloak wasn't just decorative symbolism, it marked them as servants of Enki, who himself was lord of the fresh waters that flowed beneath the earth. Water meant life in the arid lands of Mesopotamia. Every drop was precious, channeled through intricate irrigation systems, stored in cisterns, celebrated in rituals. The sages wearing water's symbol announced their role as bringers of life, as sources of the fertility and abundance that would allow civilization to flourish. When you see ancient Assyrian palace reliefs showing winged figures with fish cloaks carrying buckets and pine cones, you're looking at depictions of the Apkallu, still revered thousands of years after the flood supposedly swept them away. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the seven sages, we need to understand the world they entered and the god who created them. We need to journey to Eridu, to meet Enki, and to comprehend what civilization meant to people who were living through its birth. The god who made the sages. Enki stands among the most complex and fascinating deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon. His Sumerian name might mean Lord of the Earth, though scholars still debate the exact translation. The Akkadians knew him as Ea. By any name, he represented wisdom, intelligence, craftiness, fresh water, magic, and creation itself. Unlike the stern sky god Anu or the harsh wind lord Enlil, Enki consistently favored humanity. Time and again in Mesopotamian myths, when other gods sought to destroy or punish people, Enki found ways to protect them, to grant them another chance, to share divine knowledge despite the objections of his divine peers. His home was the Abzu, a concept that requires some unpacking to understand. The ancient Mesopotamians conceived of the universe in layers. Above stretched the dome of heaven where the high gods dwelled. Below the surface of the earth lay the Abzu, an infinite ocean of fresh water. This wasn't a metaphor. They believed literally that beneath the ground flowed a cosmic sea, the source of all springs, rivers, and wells. When you dug deep enough, you reached this primordial water, and deep within those waters, in a palace of extraordinary beauty, lived Enki. His temple in Eridu was called Abzu, House of the Abzu, or Iangura, House of the Subterranean Water. Archaeological excavations at the site revealed 18 successive temple rebuildings, each constructed atop the ruins of its predecessor, creating a mound 60 feet high. The earliest temple dates to around 5400 BCE, making it one of the oldest religious structures ever discovered. For thousands of years, priests maintained this sacred site, performing rituals, making offerings, consulting omens. They saw themselves as servants of Enki, continuing the work the god had begun when he established Eridu as the first city. Ancient texts describe Enki with flowing streams emerging from his shoulders, representing the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that made Mesopotamian civilization possible. Artists depicted him with a long beard, wearing a horned crown that marked his divine status, robed in elaborate garments that flowed like water itself. Fish swam in the streams that poured from his body. His sacred animals were the goatfish, a hybrid creature that became the basis for the astrological sign Capricorn, and the turtle, symbol of patience and earthly wisdom. But Enki's defining characteristic wasn't his appearance or his dominion over water. It was his intelligence, his wisdom, his cleverness. Other gods might be stronger or command greater cosmic forces, but none could match Enki for sheer brilliance. He solved problems others couldn't even comprehend. When the gods created humanity to serve as their laborers but found humans too loud and troublesome, it was Enki who devised solutions. When Enlil decided to destroy humanity with a flood, Enki found a way to save at least some people. His mind worked in complex, multi-layered ways, seeing connections and possibilities that escaped even divine perception. This intellectual nature made him the natural patron of scribes, scholars, craftsmen, and artists. Anyone who worked with their mind rather than just their muscles looked to Enki for inspiration and protection. The me, those divine decrees or powers that governed all aspects of civilization, belonged to Enki. These weren't abstract concepts. The Sumerians understood the me as actual things that could be given, stolen, or lost. They encompassed everything from kingship and warfare to music and lovemaking, from writing and mathematics to beer brewing and honest speech. Enki kept the me in his temple at Eridu until the goddess Inanna came visiting. In one of the most famous Mesopotamian myths, she got the god drunk on beer and convinced him to give her all the me. The next morning, suffering from his hangover, Enki realized what he'd done and sent demons to retrieve his gifts. But Inanna escaped back to her city of Uruk with the me intact, and Enki, recognizing that power had shifted northward, accepted the new order. This myth reflects actual historical changes, the transfer of political dominance from Eridu to Uruk around 3000 BCE, but it also reveals Enki's character. Even when tricked, even when bested, he adapted rather than raging. Wisdom meant accepting reality, however uncomfortable. His relationship with humanity was unique among the great gods. In the Atrahasis myth and the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enki creates humans from clay mixed with the divine blood. He shapes them, gives them form, breathes capability into them. They are literally his work, his craft, and like any skilled craftsman, he takes pride in his creation and seeks to protect it. When Enlil grows angry at human noise and sends first disease, then drought, then famine, and finally the great flood to destroy humanity, Enki subverts each attempt. He teaches humans medicine to fight disease. He shows them how to dig deeper wells during drought. He reveals food preservation techniques during famine. And when the flood comes, he warns one faithful man to build a boat and survive. This pattern of protection and teaching defines Enki's mythology. He doesn't want humans to remain ignorant, helpless, dependent. He wants them to thrive, to grow, to develop their own wisdom. And this is why he created the 7 sages. They were his hands in the mortal world, his voice teaching essential knowledge, his instruments for ensuring that civilization would take root and flourish. The creation of the Apkallu happened in the Abzu, in those cosmic waters that lay beneath everything. Enki, in his infinite wisdom, shaped 7 beings from the primordial substance of the deep. He endowed them with sublime intelligence, with knowledge spanning all the arts of civilization. They weren't quite gods, but they surpassed mortals by an unbridgeable gap. Semi-divine, the texts call them. They could take physical form, interact with humans, eat and drink and speak. Yet they also possessed powers no human could match. They knew the future through divination. They could speak words that commanded natural forces. They understood the sacred formulas and rituals that connected earth to heaven. Each sage received a specific domain of knowledge, though the texts don't always clearly delineate these boundaries. Together they encompassed everything humans would need: agriculture and irrigation, architecture and city planning, writing and mathematics, law and justice, medicine and healing, divination and magic, ritual and sacrifice. They were a complete curriculum in human civilization, walking encyclopedias of everything that separated humans from animals. And Enki gave them one more crucial gift: the motivation to teach. Unlike some divine beings who hoarded knowledge or shared it grudgingly, the 7 sages actively sought to educate humanity. They wanted people to learn, to understand, to master these arts. Their mission was transformation, elevating humans from their primitive state into something greater, something capable of building cities and writing epics and understanding the movements of celestial bodies. The texts describe them with reverence bordering on worship. Later Mesopotamian kings claimed wisdom like the Apkallu. Sennacherib boasted of his knowledge. Ashurbanipal styled himself as having grasped the craft of Adapa. Exorcist priests invoked the sages during rituals, sometimes declaring themselves to be Adapa or another sage, channeling that ancient wisdom. Plaques depicting the Apkallu were placed in houses to ward off evil, their images protecting families just as the sages themselves had protected early humanity. But among the 7, one stands above the rest. One sage whose story is told in more detail, whose personality emerges from the ancient texts with unusual clarity, whose relationship with Enki and the gods shaped not just Sumerian mythology, but influenced later traditions from Babylon to Greece to the biblical texts themselves. His name was Uana in Sumerian, Adapa in Akkadian, Oannes when the Greek writer Berossus told his story. He was the first of the 7 sages, the one who advised the first king, the one who came closest to achieving something no mortal had ever accomplished. His myth deserves its own telling, and that's where we turn next in our journey through these ancient tablets. The first and greatest, Oannes called Adapa. The story of Adapa, the first of the 7 sages, comes to us from several fragmentary tablets found at different sea sites across Mesopotamia. The most complete versions were discovered at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, in the diplomatic archives of the 14th century BCE, and in the Great Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. That these tablets travelled so far from Sumer that they were copied and recopied for thousands of years tells us something about how important this myth was to ancient people. Adapa was not born like humans are born. Enki created him in the Abzu, shaping him from the primordial waters and clay, endowing him with intelligence that surpassed even the other sages. Some texts call him the son of Enki, though whether this is literal or figurative remains unclear. What matters is that Adapa possessed wisdom beyond any mortal, beyond perhaps any being except the gods themselves. Enki made him perfect in understanding, gave him knowledge of all things necessary for civilization, taught him the secrets of heaven and earth. But there was one thing Enki did not give him: immortality. Adapa was wise, brilliant, nearly godlike in his understanding, yet he remained mortal. He would age and die like any human. This limitation becomes the center of his tragedy, and the myth that explains why humans, despite all their wisdom and achievement, cannot escape death. Adapa served as priest of Enki's temple in Eridu. His duties included preparing the ritual bread and water for offerings, maintaining the sacred space, and fishing in the Persian Gulf to provide food for the temple. Every day he would take his boat onto the waters, casting his nets, bringing back the fish that sustained the religious community. This fishing wasn't just practical work. It was sacred activity, connecting earth to water, temple to sea, mortal world to Enki's realm. One particular day, as recounted in the myth, Adapa was fishing on calm seas when the south wind rose suddenly with terrible force. In an instant the wind transformed placid water into violent chaos. Waves crashed over his boat. The vessel capsized, throwing Adapa into the cold depths. He struggled against the current, against the wind's fury, barely managing to reach shore alive. And when he stood dripping on the beach, exhausted and furious, he wasn't thinking about divine consequences. He was thinking about revenge. Adapa possessed more than just wisdom. He had been given command over words of power, incantations that could affect the natural world. In his rage, soaked and shaking from his near-drowning experience, he spoke a curse against the south wind. "Your wing I will break," he declared. And such was the power in his words, such was his authority as Enki's creation, that the curse took effect immediately. The south wind, conceptualized as a divine being with wings, found its wings shattered. It could no longer blow. For 7 days the south wind remained still. In the burning heat of Mesopotamia, where temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees, the cooling breeze from the Persian Gulf meant survival. Without it the land baked, people sweltered, crops withered. The absence of the south wind was a crisis felt across the entire region. And in his high heaven, Anu, the king of the gods, the sky god who ruled over all cosmic forces, noticed the disturbance and demanded answers. "Why does the south wind not blow?" Anu asked his vizier. The official investigated and returned with disturbing news. "My lord, a mortal named Adapa, has broken the wing of the south wind. He spoke words of power, and the wind can no longer move." The tablets describe Anu's reaction as crying out, "Help!" or "mercy," depending on the translation. This wasn't just anger at a mortal overstepping his bounds. The cosmic order had been disrupted. A human or semi-divine sage, or however one classified Adapa, had harmed a natural force that belonged to the realm of the gods. This could not stand. Anu summoned Adapa to heaven to answer for his crime. But Enki learned of this summons, and his protective instincts toward his creation kicked into gear. He called Adapa to him and gave careful, specific instructions about how to behave in heaven. The guidance reveals Enki's complex nature and sets up the tragedy to come. When you journey to heaven, Enki told Adapa, you will come to Anu's gate. There you will meet Tammuz and Gishida, the divine gatekeepers. They will ask why you appear in mourning garments. Enki then instructed Adapa to wear sackcloth, the traditional clothing of grief, and to tell the gatekeepers a specific lie, that he mourned their absence from earth. This will gain their sympathy, Enki explained. They will speak well of you to Anu, but listen carefully. When you are brought before Anu, he will offer you bread and water. You must refuse both. Do not eat or drink anything in heaven. Accept only oil for anointing and a garment if offered, but refuse all food and drink. They will be the bread and water of death. If you eat or drink, you will die. Why did Enki give this warning? The texts leave his motivation ambiguous. Some scholars believe Enki genuinely thought Anu would try to poison Adapa. Others argue Enki knew exactly what would happen and deliberately prevented Adapa from gaining immortality, keeping humans mortal to preserve the distinction between gods and mortals. A third interpretation suggests Enki was simply cautious, warning against the most likely danger, but was genuinely mistaken about Anu's intentions. Adapa followed Enki's instructions precisely. He clothed himself in mourning garments and ascended to heaven, travelling the path between earth and sky that normally only gods traversed. When he reached Anu's gate, Tammuz and Gishida did indeed question him. Why do you appear in mourning? For whom do you grieve? In our land, Adapa replied, 2 gods have disappeared. Therefore I wear these garments of sorrow. Which gods have vanished? They asked. Tammuz and Gishida, Adapa answered, naming the very deities before him. This clever answer, placing them as the objects of his mourning, achieved exactly what Enki predicted. The gatekeepers were touched by his devotion, impressed by his concern for their welfare. When Adapa was brought before Anu, Tammuz and Gishida spoke favourably of him, interceding on his behalf. Anu, hearing their testimony and seeing Adapa's humble appearance, found his anger softening. This mortal, or whatever Adapa was, had broken the south wind's wing, yes, but he had done so in extremity, after being thrown into the sea. His response was excessive but understandable. Moreover, he showed proper respect for the gods. Rather than destroying Adapa or sending him back to earth with punishment, Anu made an astonishing decision. He would offer Adapa immortality, raising him to divine status in recognition of his wisdom. Servants brought forward the bread of life and the water of life. These were not metaphors. Ancient Mesopotamians believed literally in substances that could grant eternal existence. Eat this bread, drink this water, and death would have no power over you. You would become as the gods, living forever in heaven. Anu extended this incredible gift to Adapa. Eat, the king of gods commanded. Drink. But Adapa remembered Enki's warning. His creator, his father, the god of wisdom himself, had told him that food and drink offered in heaven would be poisoned, would be the bread and water of death. Despite Anu's command, despite the urging of the divine court, Adapa refused. I will not eat, I will not drink. When oil was offered, he accepted it and anointed himself. When a robe was offered, he put it on. But the food and water he rejected absolutely. Anu was baffled. Why will you not eat and drink? He asked. Adapa replied, Ere my lord instructed me to refuse. And then Anu laughed. It wasn't cruel mockery. It was the laughter of someone recognizing a cosmic joke. Ea has tricked you, Anu told Adapa. I offered you the bread of life and the water of life. You could have become immortal, living forever among the gods, but you refused following Ea's counsel. Now you must return to earth and live out your mortal span. The tablets record Anu's next words. What ill has he brought on mankind? It's a rhetorical question acknowledging that Adapa's refusal of immortality affects not just him but all humanity. Because Adapa represents humans, because his fate determines their fate, his loss of immortality means all people will remain mortal. Death entered the world not through sin or punishment, but through a tragic misunderstanding between a wise God and his wisest creation. Some versions of the myth end here, with Adapa returning to Earth, his chance at eternal life lost forever. Other fragments suggest additional consequences. Disease would plague humanity, though the healing goddess Ninkarak would provide remedies. Wisdom would remain available to people, but not the ultimate wisdom that defeats death. Humans could build civilizations, write epics, understand mathematics and astronomy, but they would always know that despite all their achievements, death waited at the end. Modern scholars debate what this myth really means. Some see it as parallel to the biblical story of Adam and Eve, another tale explaining why humans are mortal despite being made in the image of the divine. Others emphasize the difference. Adam and Eve chose to disobey and lost paradise, while Adapa obeyed perfectly and still lost immortality. The tragedy is deeper because there's no moral failing, no sin to explain the outcome. Adapa did exactly what wisdom demanded, and wisdom failed him. But perhaps there's another way to understand the myth. The ancient Mesopotamians who told this story weren't necessarily saying humans deserved immortality and were unfairly denied it. Maybe they were exploring a more profound question. What does it mean to be human? Gods are immortal, unchanging, existing outside of time. Humans live briefly, change constantly, experience time as a river carrying them toward death. If humans became immortal, would they still be human? Or would they become something else, neither mortal nor truly divine, caught between categories? Oedipu's refusal of immortality, even though he didn't understand what he was refusing, marks humans as forever distinct from gods. Wisdom and mortality become intertwined. To be human is to know you will die, and paradoxically, that knowledge drives human achievement. We build because our time is limited. We create because we won't last. We teach the next generation because we won't be here to do the work ourselves. Mortality creates civilization, gives it urgency and meaning and purpose. The myth also reveals something crucial about the relationship between gods and humans in Mesopotamian thought. The gods aren't enemies of humanity. Anu was willing to grant immortality. Enki consistently protects humans, but there are boundaries, proper orders, hierarchies that must be maintained. Humans can have wisdom, can build cities, can understand the cosmos, but they cannot have everything. Some things remain divine prerogatives, and the gods in their wisdom ensure these boundaries hold even when they feel compassion for mortals. Oedipu's story doesn't end with his return to Earth. He continued as a sage, as Enki's priest, as the first and greatest of the seven. His wisdom, undiminished by his loss of immortality, shaped Eridu and all of early civilization. Later traditions remember him as the inventor of speech, the father of writing, the source of healing knowledge. Exorcist priests invoked his name for millennia after his death. I am Adapa, sage of the Abzu. They would declare this during rituals, channeling his power, his authority, his connection to Enki. The myth survived because it addressed fundamental human concerns. Why do we die? Why, if we can understand so much, can we not understand how to live forever? Why does wisdom coexist with mortality? The story doesn't provide comfortable answers. It doesn't promise an afterlife where death is reversed or reward in another realm. It simply says, this is the human condition. You are wise and you will die. Live accordingly. And Adapa, the first sage, embodies this condition perfectly. He was the wisest being who ever lived, possessed knowledge that surpassed all others, understood the deepest mysteries of existence. Yet death claimed him as it claims everyone. His legacy wasn't immortality but wisdom itself, passed down through countless generations, preserved in the texts we can still read today, still teaching us 4,000 years after the original tablets were written. But Adapa was only the first of 7. 6 other sages followed him, each bringing their own gifts, each shaping civilization in crucial ways. The ancient texts preserve their names, though the details of their individual stories are less complete than Adapa's myth. Yet together, the 7 sages formed a complete system of knowledge transfer from divine to human realm, from primordial wisdom to practical civilization. The complete 7, names, roles, and legacy. The Uruk list of kings and sages provides the most complete enumeration of the 7 antediluvian sages, though other sources offer variations in spelling and small details. Each sage was paired with a king, establishing a pattern where divine wisdom guided mortal rule. This wasn't just mythology. Ancient Mesopotamian kings genuinely believed their authority required both temporal power and divine counsel. A king without a sage was incomplete, illegitimate, unable to fulfill his cosmic role. The first was Uana, also called Adapa, about whom we've already heard. The texts describe him as one who finished the plans for heaven and earth, suggesting his wisdom encompassed cosmology, the fundamental structure of existence. As advisor to Alulim, the first king to rule when kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, Uana Adapa established the pattern all subsequent sages would follow. His domain included not just abstract wisdom but practical knowledge: agriculture, irrigation, architecture, the organization of labor, the maintenance of temples. Everything needed to transform a collection of mud huts into the world's first city fell under his guidance. The second sage was Wanduga, sometimes written as Wanaduga. The texts state he was endowed with comprehensive intelligence. This characterization suggests his particular strength lay in seeing connections, understanding how different aspects of civilization fit together. While Uana provided foundational knowledge, Wanduga might have specialized in systems thinking, in showing how agriculture supports cities, how cities require laws, how laws depend on writing, how writing preserves tradition, and how tradition maintains civilization across generations. He advised the second antediluvian king, whose name varies across sources. The third sage bore the name Enmeduga, described as one who was allotted a good fate. This phrase hints at divination, at understanding and shaping destiny. In Mesopotamian thought, fate wasn't absolutely fixed. Through proper rituals, through understanding omens, through aligning human action with divine will, one could influence fate, steer towards good outcomes and away from calamity. Enmeduga likely brought knowledge of these divinatory arts, teaching humans how to read signs in smoke, in entrails, in the movements of stars, in dreams. This wasn't superstition, but a sophisticated system for making decisions in the face of uncertainty. The fourth sage was Enmegalama. The meaning of his name and his particular specialization remain less clear from surviving texts. What we know is that, like his predecessors, he advised a king, guided a city, contributed essential knowledge. Some scholars speculate he may have been associated with law and justice, with the establishment of legal codes and systems of judgment. Early Mesopotamian law codes, like that of Ur-Nammu, dating to the 21st century BCE, claimed divine inspiration. The principles they encoded might trace back to wisdom transmitted by Enmegalama and preserved through oral tradition for thousands of years before finally being written down. The fifth sage bore the name Enmebuluga. Again, specific details about his individual contributions remain obscure, but the pattern holds: a sage created by Enki, possessed of sublime wisdom, serving as advisor to an antediluvian king, teaching humans crucial aspects of civilization. The fact that we have less information about the Middle Sages shouldn't diminish their importance. The transmission of ancient texts is fragmentary. Much has been lost. What survives often does so by accident, because tablets happen to be buried in the right place, because later scribes chose to copy certain texts and not others. The sixth sage was Anu-Enlilda, sometimes written as Anu-Enlilda. His name connects him to both Anu, the sky god, and Enlil, the wind god, suggesting his knowledge might have encompassed astronomy and meteorology. Understanding the heavens was essential in Mesopotamia. The movements of celestial bodies determined planting and harvest times, governed religious festivals, provided the basis for the calendar. Similarly, understanding weather patterns, particularly the winds and rains, meant the difference between abundance and famine, and Enlilda's wisdom might have included these vital sciences, teaching humans to track the stars, to predict seasons, to anticipate storms. The seventh and final antediluvian sage was Utuabzu. His name means seer, or one who knows the day, again suggesting specialization in divination and prophecy. Some scholars identify Utu-Abzu with Adapa, seeing them as different names for the same figure, but most traditions maintain them as separate individuals. As the last sage before the flood, Utu-Abzu holds special significance. Some versions of the myth claim he ascended to heaven, taken by the gods as Enoch would be in later Jewish tradition. This parallel suggests possible influence between Mesopotamian and biblical traditions, with the figure of the seventh wise man being transformed across cultures. What's remarkable about these seven is how precisely later Mesopotamians remembered them. The names appear in multiple texts spanning thousands of years. The Uruk list from the 2nd century BCE, the Bitmeseri incantation series from Neo-Assyrian times, the writings of Berossus from the 3rd century BCE all enumerate the same 7 sages in the same order. This consistency across time and geography suggests a powerful tradition, a shared belief in these 7 figures as the source of all civilization. The texts don't merely list names, they emphasize the sages' functions and characteristics. They were purifiers, associated with ritual cleansing and the expulsion of evil. They were builders, credited with laying the foundations of the 7 ancient cities. They were scribes, inventors, and transmitters of writing. They were physicians, creating 21 poultices to combat disease. They were magicians, possessing knowledge of incantations and sacred formulas. In short, they encompassed every aspect of advanced civilization. The Bitmeseri text provides fascinating additional detail. This was a ritual series used for protecting houses from evil spirits and malevolent forces. Part of the ritual involved placing plaques or statues of the Apkallu in the foundation of buildings or on walls. The text invokes the 7 sages by name, calling on them to purify the space, to drive out demons, to establish divine protection. The incantation reads, Incantation, the great Paradu fish of Enki, the Apkallu of the Abzu, the 7 Apkallu who are created in the Abzu, who ensure the plans of heaven and earth, Uana, Uanaduga, Enmaduga, Enmegalama, Enmebeluga, and Enlilda, Utu-Abzu, the 7 sages who came from the Abzu, who cleansed the plans of heaven and earth. Exorcism. This wasn't just historical reference. Thousands of years after the sages supposedly lived, Mesopotamians still believed in their power, still called on them for protection, still saw them as active forces that could be invoked through ritual. The sages weren't just ancient teachers, they were eternal guardians, present in the foundations of every properly constructed building, watching over families, preventing harm. Archaeological excavations have found these protective plaques at multiple sites. Small clay or stone figures depicting fishmen or birdmen or anthropomorphic sages with fish cloaks, buried in foundation deposits or mounted on walls. Each one represents a prayer made physical, a request for the Apkallu's protection made manifest in durable material. When you hold one of these artifacts in a museum, you're touching an object that someone 4,000 years ago believed would keep their family safe through the power of the 7 sages. The sages were also credited with founding 7 specific cities, establishing them as centers of civilization. The tradition identifies these as Eridu, Ur, Nippur, Kulab, Kesh, Lagash, and Shuruppak. Each city had its own patron deity, its own character, its own role in the development of Mesopotamian civilization. Together they formed a network of urban centers that dominated southern Mesopotamia for millennia. Eridu, as we've discussed, was the oldest, home of Enki, birthplace of civilization. Ur, the home of Abraham in biblical tradition, became a wealthy trading center, famous for its royal tombs filled with treasures. Nippur served as the religious heart of Mesopotamia, sacred to Enlil, never a capital but always politically significant because kingship required recognition at its temples. Kulab, later absorbed into Uruk, was the realm of the goddess Inanna. Kesh, located in the north, held ancient prestige though it faded earlier than other cities. Lagash became famous for its law codes and literate culture. Shuruppak, associated with the flood hero Zusudra, was the last city ruled by kings before the deluge destroyed the old world. The connection between sages and cities suggests something profound about how ancient Mesopotamians understood urban life. Cities weren't just large settlements. They were sacred spaces, founded with divine approval, organized according to cosmic patterns, maintained through proper rituals. The fact that sages founded them meant civilization itself was a divine gift, not merely a human achievement. When you walked the streets of Ur or worshipped in the temples of Nippur, you walked where the Apkallu had walked, where divine wisdom had been imparted, where heaven and earth had touched. But the age of the sages couldn't last forever. The texts speak of growing noise, of human populations expanding, of the gods becoming disturbed by the clamour of civilization. And eventually the divine assembly decided that the experiment was gone far enough. The old world would end, the flood would come, and when the waters receded, the age of the antediluvian sages would be finished. The Great Flood and the Transformation. Every culture with ancient roots has a flood myth. The biblical story of Noah is the most famous in the West, but the Mesopotamian versions are older and in many ways richer. The Sumerian flood story, the Atrahasis epic, the flood tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, all tell variations on the same theme. The gods decided to destroy humanity with a catastrophic deluge, but one wise man was warned and built a boat to survive. The reasons for the flood vary across versions. In Atrahasis, the gods are disturbed by human noise. The populations have grown so large and making so much clamour that Enlil, the chief god, cannot sleep. He tries lesser measures first: disease, drought, famine. But humans, guided by Enki's wisdom, survive each calamity. Finally, Enlil convinces the divine council to unleash a complete flood that will drown everything and everyone. In other versions, the motivation is more moral. Humans have become wicked, have violated divine laws, have forgotten the proper relationship between mortal and immortal realms. The flood serves as punishment, a reset, wiping the slate clean so a better civilization can emerge. But regardless of motivation, the result is the same. Waters cover the earth, cities drown, the old world ends. Enki, true to his protective nature toward humanity, couldn't let everyone die. He went to Shurapak, to a faithful man named Zusudra in Sumerian tradition, Atrahasis in Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The details of the warning vary, but the essence is consistent. Build a boat, make it strong, load it with animals and seeds, ride out the flood, preserve life for the world to come. Zusudra followed Enki's instructions. He built an enormous vessel, sealed it with pitch, loaded his family and livestock and grain. When the flood came, it was beyond imagining. Rain fell for 7 days and 7 nights without ceasing. Rivers overflowed their banks, the oceans rose, everything was submerged. The gods themselves, some texts say, were frightened by the destruction they had unleashed. They huddled together in heaven, watching the catastrophe unfold, perhaps regretting their decision. But Zusudra's boat floated safely. When the waters finally receded, when dry land appeared again, he made sacrifices to the gods. They smelled the sweet smoke of the offerings, realized they had nearly destroyed the workforce that provided their food through sacrifice, and accepted that humanity would continue. Enlil was angry that anyone survived, but Enki defended his actions. Humanity would live on, though in a modified form. The new humans would be more mortal, less noisy, shorter lived than their antediluvian ancestors. And what of the 7 sages during all this? The poem of Era, a Babylonian myth from the 1st millennium BCE, provides the answer. After the flood, Marduk, who had become chief of the Babylonian pantheon, banished the Apkallu. He sent them back to the Abzu, to the cosmic waters from which they had originally emerged. They could no longer walk freely on earth, could no longer advise kings directly, could no longer transform human society through immediate divine wisdom. The text of the poem of Era makes this banishment explicit. Where are the 7 sages of the Apsu, the Purpuridu fish, who just as their lord Ea have been endowed with sublime wisdom? I made those Omanus go down to the Apsu. Marduk speaks these words, acknowledging what has been lost. But this wasn't the end of wisdom's transmission to humanity. The tradition held that after the flood, a new kind of sage emerged. These were not divine creations, but humans, or semi-divine beings born from unions between the surviving Apkallu and human women. The texts call them Umanu, meaning scholars or scribes or learned ones. They weren't pure Apkallu, lacked the full power and knowledge of the antediluvian sages, but they carried enough of that divine wisdom to continue the work. The Uruk list of kings and sages, after enumerating the 7 antediluvian Apkallu, transitions to listing Umanu who advised post-diluvian kings. 4 names appear: Nungal Pirigildim, Pirigal Nungal, Pirigal Absu, and Lunana. These were 2/3 Apkallu, 1/3 human, according to some texts. They operated during the reigns of historical kings like Enmerkar of Uruk, bridging the gap between mythological past and recorded history. This transition from divine sages to human scholars represents something profound in Mesopotamian thought. The age of direct divine intervention had ended. Gods no longer walked among humans as they once did. The Apkallu no longer emerged daily from the sea to teach. But wisdom hadn't vanished. It had been internalized, made part of human culture, passed down through teaching and tradition rather than direct divine transmission. This is why scribes and scholars saw themselves as heirs to the Apkallu. They weren't just copying old texts. They were continuing a sacred mission that began in the age before the flood. Every time a scribe trained a student, every time a priest performed a ritual correctly, every time a physician healed a patient using the 21 poultices, they were channeling the wisdom of the 7 sages. The line remained unbroken from Wana Adapa through thousands of years to the Hellenistic period and beyond. The concept of a scholarly genealogy connecting current practitioners to mythological origins might seem strange to modern minds. We separate myth from history, legend from fact. But ancient Mesopotamians saw continuity. Yes, the Apkallu were extraordinary beings from a time before the flood, but their knowledge was real, their teachings genuine, their wisdom still accessible through proper transmission. A Neo-Assyrian exorcist priest declaring, "I am Adapa, sage of the Abzu," wasn't claiming to be Adapa literally. He was asserting his place in an unbroken chain of wisdom keepers, his authority to speak and act drawing legitimacy from that ancient source. This explains why king after king claimed wisdom like the Apkallu. Sennacherib, ruling in the 7th century BCE, thousands of years after Eridu's founding, boasted that he possessed understanding equal to the sages. Ashurbanipal, who created the greatest library of the ancient world at Nineveh, styled himself as having mastered the craft of Adapa. These weren't empty boasts. They reflected a genuine belief that royal legitimacy required not just military power or inherited right, but wisdom, learning, connection to the ancient sources of all civilization. The flood, then, didn't end the work of the 7 sages. It transformed it, moved it from a direct divine intervention model to a human transmission model. Knowledge became something you earned through study rather than received through revelation. But the knowledge itself, the content of civilization, remained unchanged. Agriculture, irrigation, architecture, writing, mathematics, law, medicine, divination, all the arts the Apkallu taught, all these continued and developed. The sages' legacy wasn't just a story told about the distant past. It was the living reality of Mesopotamian culture itself. Some scholars argue the flood myth reflects actual historical events, perhaps severe flooding in southern Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE. Archaeological evidence shows flood layers at multiple sites including Shurapak, suggesting catastrophic inundation that disrupted but didn't completely destroy early civilization. If such floods occurred, they would have seemed apocalyptic to people living through them, explaining why the memory persisted and was mythologized into a divine judgment story. But whether the flood was historical or purely mythological matters less than what the story accomplished culturally. It provided a break, a before and after, a way to acknowledge that civilization's birth was difficult and transformative. The antediluvian age was different, more directly connected to the divine, more marvelous. The post-diluvian age was the world people actually inhabited, where gods were distant, where wisdom required effort to obtain, where mortality was certain. The banishment of the Apkallu to the Abzu completed their transformation from historical figures to eternal archetypes. They no longer walked the earth, but they remained present in foundation deposits, in ritual invocations, in the memory of scholars and kings. They were simultaneously gone and ever present, absent from physical reality but pervading cultural consciousness. This dual nature, no longer here yet never truly gone, gave them enormous power as symbols. And the tradition didn't die with ancient Mesopotamia. When Greek writers encountered Babylonian culture, they were fascinated by stories of the Apkallu. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek in the 3rd century BCE, preserved these myths for non-Mesopotamian audiences. His description of Wanes, the fish man who emerged from the sea to teach civilization, became famous throughout the Hellenistic world. Later traditions would continue adapting and transforming these ideas, but the core remained recognizable. Before humans learned civilization themselves, divine beings taught them. The texts that preserve the memory. Understanding the 7 sages requires understanding the texts that preserve their story. These weren't single unified documents, but rather multiple sources from different periods, written by different scribes serving different purposes. Yet they maintain remarkable consistency, suggesting a powerful shared tradition that transcended individual composition. The most important source is the Uruk list of kings and sages, the text we've referenced repeatedly. This cuneiform tablet, designated W20037, was discovered by German archaeologists during excavations at Uruk in the 1959-60 season. The tablet was found in the Bit Resh temple complex, dedicated to the god Anu, and published by Jan van Dyck in 1962. The physical tablet itself now resides in the Baghdad Museum, catalogue number IM 65066. It dates to the Seleucid period, specifically to 165 or 164 BCE, making it relatively late in Mesopotamian history. Yet the content it preserves is ancient, drawing on traditions that were already thousands of years old when the tablet was inscribed. The Uruk list's format is straightforward but profound. It pairs kings with their corresponding sages, establishing a chronological sequence that runs from the antediluvian age through to historical times. The first section lists the 7 Apkallu, each associated with a king who ruled before the flood. After noting the flood as a major transition, the list continues with 10 post-diluvian Umanu, human scholars who advised later kings. The last names on the list reach into the Hellenistic period, creating an unbroken genealogy of wisdom spanning more than 3,000 years of claimed history. Why was this text created? Scholars debate the specific purpose, but Alan Lenzi and others have argued convincingly that it served as propaganda for the scholarly class in Hellenistic Uruk. During this period, Mesopotamian culture faced pressure from Greek colonizers and Alexander the Great's successors. Native traditions, including the temple systems and scribal schools, needed to justify their continued existence and funding. What better justification than demonstrating an unbroken line of wisdom reaching back to the gods themselves? The text essentially says, we scholars aren't just clever people with useful skills. We are the direct descendants, intellectually and spiritually, of the 7 sages created by Enki and the Abzu before the world was made. Our knowledge is divine in origin, transmitted through unbroken tradition for millennia. To reject us, to underfund the temples, to dismiss Mesopotamian learning is to reject the very foundation of civilization itself. This rhetorical strategy proved effective enough that the text was carefully copied and preserved. The Bit Resh temple where it was found was a major center of traditional learning in Hellenistic times. Scholars associated with the temple maintained ancient practices, performed traditional rituals, and actively resisted cultural assimilation into Greek patterns. The Uruk list was part of their intellectual arsenal in that cultural resistance. But the Uruk list isn't our only source for the 7 sages. The Bitmeseri text, a ritual incantation series from Neo-Assyrian times, provides crucial corroborating evidence. This series, whose name means house of confinement or protected house, contains spells and rituals for protecting buildings from evil spirits and malevolent forces. Erika Reiner first published material from Bitmeseri in 1961, identifying a list of 7 Apkallu in a fragmentary tablet. R. Borger expanded this work in 1974, demonstrating that the list appeared in the 3rd tablet of the series and identifying traces of similar lists elsewhere. The names and order of the 7 sages in Bitmeseri match those in the Uruk list, despite being separated by hundreds of years and serving completely different purposes. The Bitmeseri list includes more than just names. It provides ritual context, showing how the sages were invoked for practical purposes. The incantation calls them the 7 sages who are created in the Abzu, who ensure the plans of heaven and earth, describing them as purifiers and protectors. The ritual practitioner, typically an exorcist priest called an Asipu, would recite this formula while placing statues or plaques of the Apkallu in a building's foundation or on its walls. Archaeological evidence confirms this practice. Excavations at multiple Neo-Assyrian sites have uncovered foundation deposits containing small figurines of fishmen, birdmen, and anthropomorphic sages. These weren't decorative art. They were functional magical objects, placed deliberately to channel the protective power of the Apkallu. When ancient Assyrians built a house or palace or temple, they didn't just worry about structural integrity. They worried about spiritual protection, about ensuring that evil forces couldn't enter, that demons couldn't cause illness or misfortune. The 7 sages, even centuries or millennia after their supposed existence, were believed capable of providing this protection. A third major source is the Babyloniaca of Berossus, written around 291 BCE. Berossus was a Babylonian priest of Bel-Marduk, who composed a 3-volume history of Babylonia in Greek, aimed at Hellenistic audiences. His work survives only in fragments quoted by later Greek and Christian writers, but these fragments include his description of the Apkallu. Berossus calls the first sage Oannes and describes them in vivid detail. The body was like that of a fish, and underneath the fish's head he had another head, and also feet below, like those of a man attached to the fish's tail. His voice and language too were articulate and human. A representation of him is preserved even to this day. Berossus claims Oannes emerged from the Persian Gulf daily to teach humanity writing, mathematics, construction, agriculture, and law. At night he would return to the sea. The description emphasizes the fish-man hybrid nature of the Apkallu, consistent with Mesopotamian iconography showing sages wearing fish cloaks or having fish bodies. This imagery wasn't arbitrary. It connected the sages to water, to Enki's realm, to the source of life. Ancient Mesopotamians saw water as fundamentally life-giving. In an arid land where rain was scarce and survival depended on irrigation, nothing was more precious than fresh water. Beings who emerged from water carried associations of fertility, abundance, and divine blessing. Berossus also provides different numbers for how many sages served particular kings. Unlike the Uruk list and Bitmeseri, which maintained 7 antediluvian sages each associated with a different king, Berossus describes 1 sage for the first king, 1 for the 4th, 4 for the 6th, and 1 for the 7th. Scholars have debated these discrepancies, generally concluding that either Berossus was working from variant traditions or that details became confused in the process of translating from cuneiform to Greek or in later copying of Berossus's work. What's remarkable isn't the minor variations but the core consistency. Across all these sources, separated by geography, time and purpose, the tradition of 7 antediluvian sages created by Enki to teach civilization remains stable. The names are the same, the general functions match, the association with primordial wisdom persists. This stability suggests the Apkallu tradition wasn't invented late or manipulated heavily by individual authors. It was genuinely ancient, deeply embedded in Mesopotamian culture, transmitted with enough care that the essential details remained intact. Other texts provide additional glimpses of the Apkallu tradition. The Poem of Error, composed around the 8th century BCE, describes their banishment after the flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh credits the sages with laying the foundations of Uruk. Temple hymns from Eridu mention the 7 sages enlarging the city. Medical texts attribute healing formulas to them. Omen series claim they revealed divinatory knowledge. Each text adds a piece to the picture, building a comprehensive portrait of beings who are simultaneously mythological and practical, divine and earthly, ancient and ever-present. The continuity of the tradition also appears in royal inscriptions. Kings regularly claimed wisdom equal to the Apkallu, or styled themselves as possessing knowledge transmitted from the sages. These weren't casual references. They were core claims about the nature of kingship itself. A king needed military strength, yes, needed political skill, needed divine favor, but he also needed wisdom, needed to be connected to the ancient sources of civilization, needed to embody the role the first kings played when they were advised by the Apkallu themselves. The texts create a web of mutual reference and reinforcement. The Uruk list points back to earlier traditions. Bitmeseri shows practical application. Berossus translates the tradition for foreign audiences. Royal inscriptions claim its authority. Ritual texts invoke its power. Together they demonstrate that the 7 sages weren't a minor element of Mesopotamian mythology. They were central, foundational, essential to how people understood their entire civilization. Modern scholars can trace references to the Apkallu back to the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE and possibly earlier. Fragments from Tel Haddad mention sage figures in antediluvian contexts. Sumerian temple hymns from Eridu reference divine counselors. The tradition was ancient when the Uruk list was compiled, ancient when Berossus wrote, ancient by any standard, and this antiquity gave it authority. The older a tradition, the more trustworthy in Mesopotamian thought. The 7 sages weren't a recent invention or a clever story. They were primordial truth, testified to by texts spanning thousands of years. The tablets themselves, the physical clay objects inscribed with cuneiform signs, carry their own significance. Clay is fragile, easily broken, yet properly fired or buried in dry conditions, it lasts essentially forever. Tablets from the 3rd millennium BCE remain readable today, their messages as clear as when they were written. The very medium conveyed permanence, suggested that what was written was meant to endure. And the scribes who created these tablets understood their role. They weren't just recording information. They were preserving wisdom, maintaining the chain of transmission from Apkallu to Amanu to themselves. Every time a scribe copied an ancient text, he participated in the ongoing work the 7 sages had begun. Every student taught to read cuneiform joined the intellectual lineage reaching back to Uana and his companions. The texts weren't dead history but living tradition, active transmission of knowledge across generations. The knowledge they taught. What exactly did the 7 sages teach humanity? The ancient texts provide extensive catalogues of their gifts, showing that civilization encompassed far more than we might initially think. It wasn't just agriculture and writing, though those were crucial. It was a complete transformation of human existence, a shift from animal-like survival to something transcendent and meaningful. Writing stands first among the Apkallu's gifts. Before writing, knowledge died with individuals. Skills could be taught directly, but nothing complex could be preserved accurately across generations. Writing changed everything. It allowed laws to be codified, business transactions to be recorded, religious texts to be standardized, history to be preserved, literature to be created. The invention of cuneiform script in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE ranks among humanity's most important technological achievements, and the Sumerians attributed it to the Apkallu. The script itself evolved over centuries, starting with simple pictographs and developing into a sophisticated system combining logographic and phonetic elements. At its height, scribes could write in multiple languages, express complex abstract ideas, create poetry that still moves readers today. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed in cuneiform, is humanity's oldest surviving epic poem, dealing with themes of friendship, mortality, the search for meaning that remain relevant 4,000 years later. Scribal education was rigorous and lengthy. Boys, typically from wealthy families, would enter scribal schools called adubas around age 7. They would spend years learning to recognize and write hundreds of cuneiform signs, to master grammatical rules, to calculate using sexagesimal mathematics, to read literature and legal formulas and ritual texts. The training was harsh. Teachers beat students who made mistakes. The curriculum was demanding, but graduates emerged as the intellectual elite of society, qualified for positions in palace administration, temple hierarchies, legal systems, or as private scribes serving merchants and landowners. And throughout their training, students learned that writing came from the Apkallu, that their craft connected them to divine origins. They copied wisdom texts attributed to the sages. They studied the Uruk list tracing scholarly lineage. They internalized the idea that to be a scribe was to be an heir of Uana, to carry forward the mission of teaching and preserving knowledge. Mathematics was another crucial gift. Mesopotamian mathematics was remarkably sophisticated, using a sexagesimal system, base 60, that allowed complex calculations. This might seem strange to us with our base 10 decimal system, but 60 has advantages. It's divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making many calculations simpler. We still use base 60 for time, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and for angles, 360 degrees in a circle, all inheritance from Mesopotamian mathematics. Scribes used mathematics for astronomy, tracking celestial movements with great precision. They could predict lunar eclipses, calculate the length of the year, determine the positions of planets. This knowledge had practical applications. The agricultural calendar depended on astronomical observations. Religious festivals needed to occur at proper times. Even navigation and military campaigns benefited from understanding celestial patterns. But beyond utility, there was something profound about mathematics itself, about discovering that reality followed quantifiable rules, that numbers could describe and predict natural phenomena. The Apkallu were credited with revealing these mathematical principles. Tablets preserve calculation methods, geometric formulas, problems and solutions that demonstrate advanced understanding. The Babylonian mathematicians could solve quadratic equations, calculate square roots, work with what we'd now call algebraic techniques. They lacked modern symbolic notation, but the mathematics itself was solid, accurate, useful. Agriculture and irrigation formed another essential domain of knowledge. Mesopotamia's fertility depended entirely on managing water. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded annually, but the flooding was unpredictable and often destructive. The solution was canal systems that diverted water, controlled flooding, distributed irrigation across fields, and allowed agriculture to thrive even in summer's brutal heat. Building and maintaining these canal systems required sophisticated engineering. Canals had to follow proper gradients so water would flow but not erode the channels. Sluice gates controlled water levels. Drainage systems prevented fields from becoming waterlogged. Labour needed to be organised for digging and maintaining canals, for annual dredging to remove accumulated silt. All of this required planning, calculation, cooperation on a scale that early humans had never attempted. The Apkallu taught these skills according to tradition. They showed how to survey land, how to calculate slopes, how to organize labor, how to maintain systems over years and decades. The connection between irrigation and civilization was direct. Without controlled water, no large populations could exist. Without large populations, no specialization of labor, no cities, no writing, no art, nothing we'd recognize as civilization. The sages' gift of irrigation knowledge was as fundamental as any other. Architecture was another crucial teaching. Early humans built simple huts from reeds and mud. The Apkallu revealed how to create monumental architecture, to build temples and palaces and city walls that would endure for centuries. This knowledge encompassed multiple disciplines: how to make mud bricks and fire them for durability, how to lay foundations that wouldn't sink or shift, how to construct arches and domes that distributed weight properly, how to create spaces that were both functional and symbolically meaningful. The great ziggurats of Mesopotamia, those stepped pyramid temples that dominated the skyline of every major city, represented the pinnacle of this architectural knowledge. They weren't just large buildings. They were cosmic diagrams in brick, connecting Earth to heaven, providing a mountain for the gods in the flat floodplain. Their construction required mathematics for surveying and calculation, engineering for stability, organization for managing thousands of workers, and theological understanding for ensuring the design properly honored the gods. Medicine formed another domain where the Apkallu's teaching proved essential. Disease was rampant in ancient Mesopotamia. Parasitic infections from irrigation water, respiratory ailments from dust and smoke, wounds from violence or accidents, complications from childbirth, all these afflicted people. Without medical knowledge, mortality rates were staggering. The sages taught healing arts, both practical and magical. The 21 poultices mentioned in texts were remedies for specific ailments. Later medical texts preserve recipes for these medicines, listing ingredients and preparation methods. Some of these remedies had genuine pharmacological effects. Mesopotamian physicians used opium for pain, antimony for eye infections, various herbs for digestive complaints. They could set broken bones, treat wounds, perform minor surgeries. Their success rate was probably low by modern standards, but they were doing something and applying systematic knowledge rather than just hoping patients would recover spontaneously. But medicine wasn't just physical treatment. It also involved spiritual dimensions. Disease was often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment. Treatment therefore required incantations along with medicines, rituals along with surgeries. The exorcist priest, the asipu, combined medical and magical roles. He would diagnose an illness through divination, determine its supernatural cause, prescribe both medicines and rituals, and invoke the protection of benevolent gods and the Apkallu themselves during treatment. This integration of practical and spiritual approaches might seem primitive to modern minds, but it reflected a worldview where physical and spiritual realms were inseparable. You couldn't treat just the body or just the soul. Both needed attention, both required proper knowledge, both fell under the wisdom the seven sages had transmitted. Law and justice formed another crucial area of Apkallu teaching. Early human societies had customs and norms, but these were informal, enforced through social pressure rather than institutional authority. The sages taught formal law, written codes that applied consistently, court systems for adjudicating disputes, punishments proportionate to crimes. The concept that human society could be governed by explicit rules known to everyone rather than by the arbitrary will of the powerful was revolutionary. The earliest surviving law codes from Mesopotamia, like the Code of Urnamu from around 2100 BCE, claim divine inspiration. The prologue typically states that the gods chose the king to establish justice in the land. These codes reflect principles the Apkallu supposedly taught: proportionate punishment, compensation for victims, distinctions between intentional and accidental harm, protection for vulnerable populations like widows and orphans. The famous Code of Hammurabi from around 1750 BCE made these principles even more explicit. The stele on which the code is inscribed shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, but the tradition behind this imagery traced back to the Apkallu. Divine wisdom became written law through the mediation of semi-divine sages, then was implemented by just kings. The chain from heaven to earth remained unbroken. Divination and prophecy formed yet another domain of sacred knowledge. The future was uncertain, but humans needed to make decisions about planting and harvest, about when to wage war, about which policies to implement. Divination provided methods for gaining insight into what would happen, or more precisely, for understanding divine will regarding future events. Multiple divination systems existed in Mesopotamia. Extispacy, examining the entrails of sacrificed animals, particularly the liver, was practiced extensively. Specialized priests called Baru became expert at reading meaning from the size, color, texture, and shape of organs. Omen collections preserved centuries of observations. If the liver looks like this, then that will happen. The system was sophisticated, codified, taught carefully to students who would become the next generation of diviners. Other divination methods included reading smoke patterns from incense, interpreting dreams, observing the flight of birds, watching astronomical phenomena, studying weather patterns, and even noting unusual events in daily life. All these systems rested on a fundamental premise. The gods communicated through signs in the natural world. Those who knew how to read these signs could understand divine messages and act accordingly. The Apkallu were credited with revealing divination systems, with teaching humans how to recognize and interpret signs. This knowledge wasn't seen as violating divine prerogative. The gods wanted to communicate, wanted humans to understand their will. Divination was the language through which this communication occurred. The sages taught the grammar and vocabulary of this language, enabling ongoing dialogue between mortal and divine realms. All these knowledge domains, writing, mathematics, agriculture, irrigation, architecture, medicine, law, divination, fit together into a comprehensive system. Civilization wasn't one thing, but many things working in harmony. You needed food production to free some people from farming, allowing specialization. You needed writing to coordinate complex activities. You needed mathematics to plan and calculate. You needed architecture to create spaces for specialized activities. You needed medicine to keep people healthy enough to work. You needed law to manage conflicts. You needed divination to make crucial decisions. The 7 sages taught the complete package, not just isolated skills. They understood how civilization worked as a system and transmitted that systemic understanding. This comprehensive wisdom explains their enduring importance in Mesopotamian culture. They weren't just inventors of useful techniques. They were the authors of civilization itself, the sources of everything that made human life meaningful and productive. Echoes across cultures. The story of the 7 sages didn't remain confined to Mesopotamia. As cultures interacted through trade, conquest, and migration, ideas spread. The concept of primordial wise beings who taught civilization appeared in multiple traditions, sometimes clearly borrowed, sometimes parallel development, often some mixture of both. The most obvious example is Greece. The Greeks had their own tradition of 7 sages, sophos in Greek, wise men who lived during the Archaic Age around 800 to 480 BCE. Plato first mentioned them by name in the 4th century BCE, though the tradition was older. The Greek 7 sages were historical figures, or at least semi-historical, not divine creations. They included Thales of Miletus, Solon of Athens, Bias of Priene, and others whose names varied across different lists. These Greek sages were philosophers, lawgivers, and practical men of affairs. They didn't teach agriculture or inventing writing, but they transmitted wisdom about governance, ethics, living well. Their famous aphorisms, "Know thyself," "Nothing in excess," "The most difficult thing is to know yourself," became foundational to Greek thought. The parallels with the Mesopotamian Apkallu are striking enough that most scholars believe the Greek tradition borrowed the idea, probably through contact with Babylonian or Assyrian culture. The number 7, the role as civilizing teachers, the transmission of foundational wisdom, all these elements match too well to be coincidence. But the Greeks adapted the concept to their own circumstances, making the sages historical rather than mythological, philosophers rather than divine beings. Biblical traditions show even more direct connections. The figure of Enoch in Genesis provides the clearest parallel. Enoch is described as the seventh patriarch from Adam, known for his wisdom and piety. Genesis 5:24 states that Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Unlike other patriarchs who died, Enoch was taken to heaven alive, translated directly into God's presence. Later Jewish traditions, particularly the books of Enoch written during the Second Temple period, elaborate extensively on Enoch's wisdom. He's shown receiving divine revelations about the calendar, about astronomy, about future events. He's taught by angels, given access to heavenly secrets, made the scribe who records human deeds. He becomes a wisdom figure par excellence, mediating divine knowledge to humanity. The parallels to Utuabzu, the seventh Apkallu, who, according to some traditions, was also taken to heaven, are too close to dismiss. Both are the seventh in a sequence. Both possess extraordinary wisdom. Both are translated to heaven rather than dying normally. Either the Jewish tradition was influenced by the Mesopotamian story, or both drew on even older shared traditions about a seventh wise man who transcended mortality. The broader biblical narrative also shows Mesopotamian influence. The creation account in Genesis, the flood story, the Tower of Babel, all have Mesopotamian parallels. The Garden of Eden story can be compared to Mesopotamian paradise myths involving Dilmun. The concept that humanity received civilization as a divine gift rather than developing it independently appears in both traditions, though the Bible presents it differently, with God teaching Adam directly rather than sending intermediary sages. Even the New Testament shows traces of Apkallu influence, though filtered through multiple cultural layers. The Gospel of John's opening, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," can be read through the lens of wisdom traditions descending from Mesopotamia. Logos, the Greek term translated as word, meant reason, wisdom, divine ordering principle. Christ as Logos embodies wisdom teaching humanity, mediating between divine and mortal realms, much as the Apkallu did, though obviously with different theological significance. The Book of Revelation's imagery of 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls reflects the Mesopotamian sacred number 7. Revelation's author, writing in the 1st century CE, drew on apocalyptic traditions that ultimately traced back to Mesopotamian divination and cosmology. The 7 angels, the 7 churches, the pervasive use of 7 throughout Revelation all echo the ancient significance of that number established thousands of years earlier by Sumerian tradition. Moving beyond the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, we find similar concepts in other cultures. Indian tradition speaks of the 7 rishis, ancient sages who received the Vedas directly from the gods and transmitted them to humanity. These rishis are stars in Ursa Major, watching over the world eternally. They taught ritual, revealed mantras, established the religious system that became Hinduism. The parallels to the Apkallu are obvious, though whether this represents independent development or ancient cultural diffusion remains debated. Chinese tradition includes the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, mythological rulers who taught civilization to the Chinese people. They revealed agriculture, established calendars, created writing, taught medicine, organized government. Again, the pattern matches. Primordial wisdom figures teaching essential knowledge to primitive humanity, making civilization possible. Whether there's any historical connection to Mesopotamian traditions is unclear, but the conceptual similarity demonstrates something universal about how early cultures understood their own origins. Native American traditions contain numerous culture hero stories, figures who taught essential skills to the people. These are usually trickster gods or animal spirits rather than fishmen, reflecting different cultural contexts. But the function remains the same, explaining how humans gained the knowledge needed for civilization, attributing that knowledge to supernatural sources rather than ordinary human invention. What do these parallels tell us? At minimum, they show that the Mesopotamian tradition of the 7 sages was influential enough to shape neighboring cultures. The Greek, Jewish, and possibly other traditions clearly knew and adapted Apkallu concepts. At maximum, they might suggest something even more profound. The early humans everywhere struggled with the same questions about how civilization began and developed similar narrative patterns to answer those questions. Why do we have writing when other animals don't? Why can we build cities, practice agriculture, organize complex societies? The answer that humans simply invented these things gradually doesn't satisfy emotionally or narratively. It's more compelling to say that divine beings taught us, that civilization is a gift from higher powers, that our knowledge connects us to transcendent sources. This interpretation doesn't require literal belief in the seven sages or their equivalents in other cultures. It recognizes that humans are storytelling creatures who need narratives to make sense of experience. The Apkallu story, in all its cultural variations, provided ancient people with a framework for understanding civilization's origins, for valuing knowledge and wisdom, for seeing education as sacred transmission rather than mere skill training. The enduring influence of this narrative pattern demonstrates its psychological and social power. We still sometimes speak of great teachers as transmitting wisdom, as initiating students into mysteries, as passing on traditions that reach back to authoritative sources. Academic genealogies trace doctoral students back through their advisors to intellectual founders. Artistic traditions claim descent from masters. Even modern science, for all its emphasis on innovation and breaking with the past, maintains certain conservative elements, certain requirements to know what came before, certain respect for foundational figures. The seven sages, then, aren't just ancient Mesopotamian mythology. They're an archetypal pattern of how humans think about knowledge, wisdom, teaching, and cultural transmission. Every culture needs its sages, its wise founders, its sources of authority. The specific details vary, but the underlying structure remains remarkably constant. And that structure was first clearly articulated, first given canonical form, in those Sumerian tablets telling of 7 fishmen emerging from the cosmic waters to teach humanity everything we would need to build civilization from nothing. Archaeological discoveries and physical evidence. For most of history, the 7 sages existed only in texts, in stories told and retold, in tablets copied by scribes who believed they preserved true history. But archaeology has provided physical evidence that makes the story more tangible, more real, connecting abstract mythology to concrete objects you can hold and see. The most dramatic evidence comes from the ruins of Eridu itself, that oldest city where the first sage emerged and where Enki had his temple. Excavations at Tel Abu Shafrain, the modern name for the site, began in 1855 under John George Taylor, continued intermittently through the early 20th century, and intensified between 1946 and 1949 under Iraqi archaeologists. What they found was remarkable. 18 successive temple buildings, each constructed directly atop the ruins of its predecessor, forming an artificial hill 60 feet high. The earliest temple, at the bottom of this accumulated mound, dates to around 5400 BCE, making it one of the oldest religious structures ever discovered. This means people were worshipping at this site for more than 5,000 years, maintaining the tradition from the Ubaid period through the Neo-Babylonian Empire, never abandoning it despite multiple conquests, cultural changes, and shifts in political power. Such extraordinary continuity suggests something deeply important was believed to be located here, something worth maintaining across millennia. The successive temples show architectural evolution. The earliest were simple structures, small rooms with altars, built from mud, brick, and reeds. As centuries passed, each rebuilding became more elaborate. Walls thickened, rooms multiplied, decorative elements appeared. The final temple, built during the Neo-Babylonian period, was a proper ziggurat, a stepped pyramid with a shrine at its summit, approached by monumental staircases, surrounded by courtyards and auxiliary buildings. But every version, from simplest to most elaborate, maintained the same orientation, the same basic plan, the same religious purpose. This was Enki's house, the Iabsu, the dwelling place of the god who created the 7 sages. Standing at the site today, you stand where Oana supposedly first emerged from the waters, where the teaching of civilization supposedly began. The location connects mythology to physical place in ways that make the story feel more substantial. Foundation deposits at various Mesopotamian sites have yielded figures of the Apkallu. These small figurines, typically made of clay or soft stone, show the sages in their various forms. Some are purely fishmen, human-headed fish bodies. Others are human figures wearing fish-skin cloaks. Still others are bird-headed figures with wings. Each type appears in different periods and contexts, suggesting evolving iconography but continuous tradition. The figurines were placed in foundation deposits when buildings were constructed, ritually buried to provide supernatural protection. This practice, mentioned in the Bit Messeri text, has been confirmed archaeologically at multiple sites. The figurines aren't just art or decoration, they're functional magical objects, placed deliberately to invoke the Apkallu's protective power. Some of the most impressive examples come from Neo-Assyrian palaces, particularly those built by Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud in the 9th century BCE. Large stone reliefs, some standing over 10 feet tall, depict winged figures with human or bird heads, wearing fish-skin cloaks carrying buckets and pine cones. These were placed at gates and in courtyards, visible guardians embodying the Apkallu's role as protectors and purifiers. The imagery is precise and symbolic. The bucket contains water from the sacred Apkallu springs, representing purification. The pine cone is a ritual tool, possibly representing the male date palm flower used in sacred ceremonies, or perhaps the mulilu, a purification device mentioned in texts. The figures are shown performing rituals, blessing spaces, driving away evil. They're not passive decorations, but active participants in the building's spiritual defense. Museum collections worldwide contain examples of these protective figures. The British Museum holds several from Nineveh and Nimrud. The Louvre has examples from various Mesopotamian sites. The Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago preserves specimens from their excavations at Nippur and other locations. Each museum placard typically identifies these as protective demons or genie figures, but the more accurate designation is Apkallu, the seven sages, whose memory remained potent enough that people commissioned expensive stone reliefs to channel their power millennia after the sages supposedly lived. Cuneiform tablets themselves constitute another category of physical evidence. Thousands of tablets preserving myths, rituals, king lists, medical texts, and scholarly compilations have been excavated from ancient Mesopotamian sites. Many are fragmentary, damaged by time and environmental conditions, but enough survive to reconstruct substantial portions of ancient literature and learning. The tablets containing Apkallu references come from multiple sites spanning more than 2,000 years. This geographical and temporal distribution shows the tradition wasn't localized to one city or confined to one period. It was genuinely widespread, deeply embedded in Mesopotamian culture at large. Library collections like that of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh contained thousands of tablets covering every aspect of knowledge. The library's collapse in 612 BCE, when the Babylonians and Medes sacked Nineveh, ironically preserved many tablets. The burning palace baked the clay tablets, making them far more durable than sun-dried tablets would have been. Archaeologists excavating the site in the mid-19th century found huge numbers of tablets, many still legible despite their age. Among these tablets were copies of the Adapa myth, ritual texts invoking the sages, scholarly compositions tracing intellectual lineages, medical prescriptions attributed to the Apkallu's teaching. Reading these tablets isn't just accessing information, it's touching minds from 4,000 years ago, understanding how ancient people thought about wisdom, knowledge, teaching, the very foundations of civilization. The physical evidence also includes administrative texts documenting scribal education. These tablets record student exercises, mistakes corrected by teachers, curricula listing what must be learned, and complaints about how hard the training was. One famous text, The school days describes a student's typical day: rising early, going to school, reciting lessons, being beaten for mistakes, returning home tired, doing more studying. The text shows that scribal education was rigorous, demanding, sometimes brutal, but it also shows that people valued education enough to endure these hardships, to spend years mastering cuneiform script and the knowledge it preserved. And always beneath the curriculum lay the implicit understanding that this knowledge traced back to divine sources, that scribes were heirs to the apkallu, that learning itself was a sacred activity connecting mortals to the gods. The physical tablets used for student exercises, the styluses that impressed cuneiform signs, the schools where education occurred all participated in the ongoing transmission of wisdom that supposedly began when Uana emerged from the Abzu to teach the first humans. Archaeological evidence also reveals the 7 ancient cities associated with the apkallu. Eridu we've already discussed. Located 12 kilometers southwest of Eridu, has been extensively excavated, revealing spectacular royal tombs, magnificent ziggurats, evidence of a wealthy cosmopolitan city connected to trade networks spanning Mesopotamia and beyond. The ziggurat of dedicated to the moon god Nana, still stands, partially restored in the 20th century, giving visitors a sense of the monumentality ancient architecture achieved. Nippur, located about halfway between Babylon and the Persian Gulf, served as Mesopotamia's religious center throughout history. Though never a capital, every king needed recognition at Nippur's temples to claim legitimate rule. Excavations here, conducted extensively by the University of Chicago and later by various institutions, uncovered more than 60,000 tablets, the largest collection from any Mesopotamian site. These tablets spanned subjects from religion to law to mathematics to literature, demonstrating Nippur's role as a major intellectual center. Kulab, later absorbed into Uruk, was originally a separate city associated with the goddess Inanna. Uruk itself became one of the largest and most important cities in ancient Mesopotamia, home to kings like Gilgamesh, the setting for magnificent temples and the birthplace of many innovations, including possibly the earliest writing. Excavations at Uruk revealed impressive architecture, sophisticated urban planning, and clear evidence of a complex literate society as early as 3200 BCE. Kesh, Lagash and Shuruppak, the remaining 3 cities from the traditional list of 7, each has its own archaeological signature. Lagash is particularly notable for its numerous inscriptions documenting administrative, legal, and religious activities. Shuruppak, associated with the flood hero Zusudra, shows a clear flood layer in its archaeological stratigraphy, suggesting that catastrophic flooding did occur at this site around 2900 BCE, possibly inspiring or reinforcing the flood mythology. The physical remains of these cities provide context for the apkallu myth. These weren't imaginary places, they were real urban centers, inhabited by real people, supported by actual agricultural systems, connected by genuine trade routes. The cities existed, and the tradition held that sages founded them. Whether the sages themselves existed as the myths described is unknowable, but the cities certainly existed, and people who lived in them believed those stories, saw themselves as inheritors of the wisdom the apkallu brought. Archaeological evidence also traces the decline and eventual abandonment of these sites. Eridu was abandoned around 600 BCE, probably due to environmental changes that made the location less viable. Declined after the Babylonian period, though it retained some significance. Nippur remained important longer than most, maintaining religious significance into the Parthian period. Uruk continued as a major city through the Seleucid period, which is when the Uruk list of kings and sages was compiled, but eventually declined and was abandoned. Walking through these ruins today, you see collapsed walls, broken pottery, sand gradually reclaiming everything. The cities that once hummed with life, that once were centers of civilization, that once seemed eternal, are now mostly silent except for the wind and occasional tourists. The physical mortality of these places mirrors human mortality, reminding us that even the greatest achievements eventually fade. Yet the knowledge, the wisdom the cities represented, the traditions preserved in tablets and in cultural memory, these survived. The seven sages might have been mythological, but what they represented, the value of wisdom, the importance of education, the power of transmitted knowledge, these remain vital today. Every school, every university, every library continues the work the Apkallu supposedly began. We still teach, still learn, still pass knowledge from one generation to the next, believing that wisdom matters, that civilization depends on education, that some things are worth preserving and transmitting across time. Depictions in art and ritual practice. The seven sages weren't just abstract concepts preserved in texts. They were vivid presences in Mesopotamian visual culture, depicted on palace walls, carved into protective amulets, moulded into clay figurines, and invoked in countless rituals spanning thousands of years. Understanding how ancient people represented the Apkallu visually and incorporated them into religious practice provides crucial insight into what these figures meant to everyday people, not just to scholars and priests. The iconography of the Apkallu evolved over time but maintained core recognizable elements. The earliest depictions, from the Kassite period around the 16th to 12th centuries BCE, show the fishman form called Paradu fish in texts. These figures have human upper bodies with bearded heads, often wearing horned crowns marking divine status. But below the waist, they're pure fish, with scales, fins, and fishtails. This hybrid form visually emphasized their origin in water, their connection to Enki's realm, their nature as beings who bridged aquatic and terrestrial worlds. Later periods, particularly Neo-Assyrian art from the 9th to 7th centuries BCE, preferred a different representation. Here the Apkallu appear fully human in form but wear elaborate fish skin cloaks draped over their bodies. The fish skin falls from their heads down their backs like a cape, the fish's head visible above their own heads, the tail reaching to their feet. This costume made them recognizably as beings associated with water and divine wisdom, while allowing more naturalistic human proportions that fit better with Assyrian artistic conventions. A third form also appeared in Neo-Assyrian art, the bird-headed Apkallu. These figures have human bodies but the heads of birds, typically eagles. They wear the same fishskin cloaks as the human-headed versions, connecting them to water symbolism despite their avian features. Some scholars suggest these bird-headed figures represent a different class of protective supernatural beings that became secondarily associated with the Apkallu tradition. Others argue they're simply stylistic variations, depicting the same seven sages in different forms depending on artistic preference or regional tradition. The most famous depictions of the Apkallu come from the palace of Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud, modern Kalhu in northern Iraq. These enormous stone reliefs, some standing over 10 feet tall, line doorways and important passages within the palace. The figures are shown in profile, facing toward the entrance they guard. Their size alone communicated power and authority. Anyone walking through those doorways passed under the watchful gaze of beings who participated in creation itself, who taught civilization, who protected against evil. The reliefs show precise iconographic details that carried meaning for ancient viewers. The Apkallu typically hold two objects, a bucket in one hand and a pine cone or similar object in the other. The bucket, called a bandudu in Akkadian, contains water drawn from sacred springs or rivers. This water possessed purifying properties, could cleanse spaces of impurity, could sanctify ground for building or ritual. The pine cone, possibly representing the male date palm flower, or a ritual tool called the mulilu, was used to sprinkle or apply the sacred water, functioning like an ancient aspergillum. The gesture captured in these reliefs shows the Apkallu performing purification rituals. They dip the pine cone into the bucket, draw it out dripping with water, and use it to sprinkle or anoint the space, the king, or whoever passes through the doorway. This wasn't just artistic decoration. It was believed to be an actual ongoing ritual, the carved figures perpetually performing their protective function, continuously purifying and blessing the palace. Some reliefs show Apkallu figures positioned around the sacred trees, stylized representations of the tree of life or the cosmic axis connecting earth to heaven. The sages perform their purification ritual upon the tree, ensuring it remains healthy and vital. This imagery connected multiple symbolic systems, the tree as cosmic principle requiring divine maintenance, the Apkallu as agents of divine order, water as life-giving force, ritual as the method through which cosmic order is sustained. The artistic style of these reliefs is extraordinarily detailed and sophisticated. The feathers on bird-headed figures are individually carved, each overlapping the next in naturalistic patterns. The scales on fish cloaks show subtle variation in size and texture. The muscles of arms and legs are anatomically accurate. The beards and hair fall in elaborate curled tiers, following Neo-Assyrian conventions for depicting dignity and importance. Even the sandals on their feet show lacing patterns and construction details. This level of artistic investment demonstrates how seriously Assyrian kings took these protective figures. Creating these reliefs required enormous resources, quarrying the stone, transporting it, employing master carvers to work for months or years, positioning the finished reliefs precisely. Kings commissioned these works not for aesthetic pleasure alone, but for functional protection, believing genuinely that having Apkallu imagery in their palaces would provide supernatural defense against enemies and evil forces. Smaller-scale depictions served similar functions in less monumental contexts. Clay plaques showing Apkallu figures have been found in domestic contexts, buried in house foundations or hung on walls. These were affordable versions of the protection palace reliefs provided, accessible to ordinary families who couldn't commission massive stone carvings. The clay plaques typically show cruder artistry than palace reliefs, but the iconography remains consistent. Fishman or human figure in fish cloak, often holding the bucket and pinecone, identified as an Apkallu through accompanying cuneiform inscriptions. Some plaques include specific invocations, short texts identifying which of the 7 sages the image represents and calling upon that sage's particular powers. A plaque might read, Uana, who completed the plans of heaven and earth, may he protect this house. Another might invoke Enmeduga for his divinatory wisdom. Families would choose which sage to invoke based on their particular needs or concerns, much as later cultures developed devotions to particular patron saints. Cylinder seals also preserved Apkallu imagery. These small stone cylinders, carved with negative relief images that create positive impressions when rolled across wet clay, were used extensively in Mesopotamia for administrative purposes, serving as signatures on documents. The images carved on seals needed to be recognizable and distinctive, establishing identity. Many seals included protective imagery, figures that would transfer to the sealed documents, providing both authentication and supernatural protection. Seals depicting Apkallu figures show them in various poses and contexts. Some show sages approaching deities, perhaps Enki himself, receiving wisdom or instructions. Others show them performing rituals, the bucket and pinecone clearly visible despite the tiny scale. Still others show them in architectural contexts, seemingly involved in building or blessing structures. Each seal image told a compressed story, communicated identity and values, and invoked protective power. The iconographic program of major temples included Apkallu imagery as essential elements. Temple gateways, the liminal spaces between sacred interior and profane exterior, required particular protection. Placing Apkallu figures at these thresholds served multiple functions. They purified those entering, prevented evil from entering, and reminded visitors of the sacred knowledge preserved within the temple walls. The sages who taught civilization became perpetual guardians of the institutions that preserved what they taught. Foundation rituals, performed when constructing major buildings, incorporated Apkallu imagery physically into the structure. The ritual process, documented in texts and confirmed archaeologically, involved preparing the construction site through purification, then placing protective objects in foundation deposits before building began. These deposits might include figurines of the Apkallu, inscribed tablets invoking their protection, precious metals, and other items carrying symbolic or magical significance. The belief was that these objects would remain buried forever, never seen by human eyes again after the building was completed, but perpetually active in their protective function. The foundation deposit created a sacred space, established the building's supernatural defenses, and connected the structure to ancient wisdom. Every major building, every temple, every palace, every significant house ideally incorporated such protection, making the Apkallu presence ubiquitous throughout Mesopotamian urban landscapes. Ritual texts provide detailed instructions for these foundation ceremonies. The priest performing the ritual would invoke the 7 sages by name, reciting their epithets, describing their achievements, calling upon them to protect the building being constructed. The language mirrors that used in the Bit Mizrahi series, demonstrating standardized formulas that scribes learned and priests memorized, ensuring ritual consistency across time and geography. The invocations weren't merely words. They were performative utterances, speech acts believed to accomplish what they described. When a priest said, "May the 7 sages who completed the plans of heaven and earth protect this house," he wasn't expressing a hope or making a request. He was causing that protection to manifest, channeling the sages' power through proper formula and ritual action. The words, if spoken correctly by an authorized priest in the proper context, had efficacy independent of belief or wish. They made things happen. This understanding of ritual language as fundamentally effective rather than merely expressive shaped how Mesopotamians approached religious practice generally. Correct performance mattered more than sincere faith. The gods and protective beings responded to properly executed rituals, not to emotional devotion. A priest who performed the Apkallu invocation flawlessly would succeed in establishing protection, even if he personally doubted the sage's existence. Conversely, someone with deep faith but poor ritual technique would fail. This emphasis on correctness drove the elaborate training systems for priests and ritual specialists. They needed to memorize extensive liturgies, master complicated procedures, understand symbolic meanings, and execute everything precisely. Any mistake, any deviation from proper form could invalidate the ritual, leaving the building unprotected despite all the effort invested. The stakes were believed to be genuinely high: spiritual protection or vulnerability, blessing or curse, success or failure. Later periods saw the Apkallu imagery become even more elaborately developed. Persian period Mesopotamia, after the Achaemenid conquest in the 6th century BCE, maintained traditional iconography while sometimes incorporating Persian stylistic elements. The fish-cloaked figures appeared in hybrid contexts, combining Mesopotamian and Persian symbolic systems. This syncretism demonstrated the Apkallu tradition's adaptability, its capacity to be reinterpreted within new cultural frameworks without losing its essential identity. Hellenistic period Uruk, where the famous king list was compiled, continued creating Apkallu imagery despite Greek cultural dominance. The Temple of Anu, where the tablet was found, contained traditional Mesopotamian art alongside Greek-influenced pieces. Priests maintained ancient rituals, invoked the 7 sages using formulas thousands of years old, and commissioned new protective plaques using iconography their ancestors would recognize. This cultural resistance through traditionalism reflected broader Mesopotamian responses to Hellenization, asserting native identity through maintained practices. The geographical distribution of Apkallu imagery also deserves attention. While concentrated in major cities and royal centers, depictions appear throughout the Mesopotamian world, from southern Babylonia to northern Assyria, from eastern border regions to western trade routes. This distribution demonstrates that the 7 sages weren't localized mythology, but genuinely pan-Mesopotamian tradition, recognized and revered across the entire civilization. Regional variations in artistic style naturally occurred. Babylonian depictions tended towards certain iconographic conventions, Assyrian toward others, but the core elements remained stable. The association with water, the protective function, the connection to primordial wisdom, the sevenfold number. An Assyrian could recognize a Babylonian Apkallu depiction and vice versa, because the tradition transcended regional differences. Some of the most intriguing Apkallu imagery appears in context suggesting private devotion, rather than official cult. Small amulets, cheap materials, crude artistry, suggesting they were accessible to ordinary people, not just elite patrons. These amulets were worn as jewelry, carried in pockets, placed in personal shrines. They represented individual relationships with the protective tradition, democratization of access to supernatural defense that otherwise concentrated in temples and palaces. The existence of such objects suggests that belief in the Apkallu's continuing power extended beyond priestly classes and educated scribes to the general population. Regular people, farmers and craftsmen and merchants, people who couldn't read cuneiform and didn't attend scholarly lectures, still knew about the seven sages, still sought their protection, still incorporated them into personal religious practice. The tradition wasn't just elite ideology, but popular belief, genuinely embedded in Mesopotamian culture at all levels. Ritual practice involving the Apkallu extended beyond foundation ceremonies and protective plaques. Exorcism rituals regularly invoked the sages, calling upon them to drive away demons and malevolent spirits. The logic was straightforward. The Apkallu possessed superior wisdom and power, were connected to the god of wisdom himself, and therefore could overcome lesser supernatural beings causing illness or misfortune. The exorcist priest, the Asipu, would identify the demon afflicting a patient through divination, then construct a ritual specifically designed to expel that particular entity. The ritual might involve incantations naming the Apkallu, offering sacrifices, creating protective circles, burning purifying incenses, and placing Apkallu figurines around the patient's bed. The combination of techniques, all drawing on the sage's authority and power, was believed to create overwhelming supernatural force that demons couldn't resist. Medical practice in ancient Mesopotamia integrated these ritual elements with practical treatments. A physician treating disease would prescribe both medicines and rituals, seeing them as complementary rather than alternative. The 21 poultices attributed to the Apkallu in texts were actual medical remedies, recipes preserved and transmitted through physician training, but administering them properly required ritual accompaniment, invocations and blessings, ensuring the medicines would work effectively. This integration of practical and supernatural reflects a worldview fundamentally different from modern scientific materialism. For ancient Mesopotamians, the physical and spiritual realms weren't separate categories, but interpenetrating aspects of single reality. Disease had both physical causes, bad humors, infections, injuries, and spiritual causes, demonic attack, divine punishment, cosmic imbalance. Successful treatment needed to address both dimensions simultaneously. The Apkallu, as beings who bridged divine and mortal realms, as teachers of both practical knowledge and sacred wisdom, were natural patrons for this integrative approach to healing. Invoking them during medical treatment acknowledged that the medicines they taught, the surgical techniques they revealed, all carried spiritual dimensions, required proper ritual framing to achieve maximum effectiveness. A physician who administered medicine without proper ritual blessing was like a scribe who copied texts without understanding them, technically competent perhaps, but missing the deeper meaning. Divination practices also regularly invoked the Apkallu. Diviners seeking to read omens would sometimes begin by calling upon the sages, asking for clarity of vision, for wisdom to interpret signs correctly, for connection to the divine knowledge the sages possessed. The invocation served multiple purposes. It established the diviner's credentials as heir to ancient wisdom, it created proper ritual atmosphere for the divinatory act, and it genuinely sought supernatural assistance in achieving accurate interpretation. Some divination texts preserve these invocations, showing standardized formulas that diviners learned during training. I call upon Uana who completed the plans of heaven and earth. I call upon Emaduga who has allotted a good fate. May they grant me wisdom to read these signs truly. The language directly connected contemporary divination practice to mythological origins, claiming continuity from the primordial past to the immediate present. The Apkallu tradition also influenced how scribes understood their own profession. Scribal colophons, the statements scribes added at the end of tablets identifying themselves and providing copying details, sometimes referenced the sages explicitly. A scribe might write, "I have copied this tablet according to the wisdom taught by the Apkallu," or, "May my scribal skill equal that of Uana who revealed writing to humanity." These weren't empty boasts, they expressed genuine belief in professional lineage reaching back to divine origins. This self-understanding as heirs to the Apkallu gave scribes significant social status and authority. They weren't just useful technicians who could read and write. They were keepers of sacred knowledge, transmitters of ancient wisdom, participants in the work the gods themselves began. This elevated status came with responsibilities to maintain a textual accuracy, to preserve traditional knowledge, to train the next generation properly, to ensure the chain of transmission remained unbroken. When we examine Apkallu imagery and ritual practice together, a comprehensive picture emerges. These weren't just characters in myths, stories told about the distant past. They were living presences in Mesopotamian culture, invoked daily in countless contexts, depicted on walls and worn as amulets, believed to provide ongoing protection and wisdom. The 7 sages inhabited every aspect of civilized life, from the foundations of buildings to the treatment of illness to the training of scribes. They were, in the fullest sense, the spirits of civilization itself. The meaning for us today. 4,000 years separate us from the scribes who first wrote about the 7 sages. The Sumerian language is long dead, spoken by no one, understood only by specialists who spent years learning it. The gods those scribes worshipped are forgotten by all but historians. The cities they inhabited are ruins, buried under sand and time. Yet somehow the story of the Apkallu still speaks to us, still carries meaning, still illuminates something about human nature and civilization that remains true despite all the changes separating their world from ours. At the most basic level, the 7 sages represent the importance of wisdom. Ancient Mesopotamia was in many ways harsh. Life was short, disease common, violence frequent. People had to work brutally hard just to survive. In such conditions, what mattered? The myth answers, wisdom matters, knowledge matters. Understanding how to organize society, how to grow food, how to maintain justice, how to pass learning to the next generation. These things matter more than brute strength or violence or immediate gratification. This prioritization of wisdom over power remains relevant. Modern societies face complex problems: climate change, technological disruption, political polarization, public health crises, economic inequality. Brute force won't solve these. Wisdom is needed. The ability to understand complex systems, to think long-term, to make difficult decisions carefully, to learn from past mistakes, all these reflect the same value the Mesopotamians encoded in their sage traditions. The myth also emphasizes that civilization is fragile, that it requires conscious effort to maintain and transmit. The flood story, the banishment of the Apkallu, the transition from divine sages to human scholars all acknowledge that civilization can be lost, knowledge can be forgotten, cities can fall, the chain of transmission can break. Therefore, every generation must consciously choose to maintain and pass on what previous generations learned. We see this today when educational systems decline, when libraries close, when universities face funding cuts, when expertise is dismissed as elitism. The ancient warnings remain pertinent. Without education, without valuing and transmitting knowledge, without maintaining the institutions that preserve and develop wisdom, civilization itself is endangered. The Apkallu tradition recognized this 4,000 years ago. We would be wise to remember it. The myth distinguishes between information and wisdom. The Apkallu didn't just teach isolated facts. They taught comprehensive understanding, systemic thinking, the connections between different domains of knowledge. Writing alone isn't enough. You need to know what to write. Agriculture alone isn't enough. You need law to organize labor and protect property. Mathematics alone isn't enough. You need to know when and how to apply it to real problems. This distinction between information and wisdom feels urgent in the modern world. We have unprecedented access to information through the internet. Anything you want to know is searchable within seconds. Yet we don't seem wiser as societies. Access to information doesn't automatically produce wisdom, doesn't guarantee good judgment, doesn't ensure thoughtful decisions. The Apkallu understood that wisdom required not just knowing things, but understanding how things fit together, how to apply knowledge ethically, how to think about consequences, how to balance competing values. These metacognitive skills remain as essential and as difficult to develop as ever. The tradition of the Seven Sages also affirms that teaching is sacred work, that educators participate in something profound and eternal. Every teacher who helps a student understand a difficult concept, every parent who patiently explains the world to a child, every mentor who guides a younger person, participates in the work the Apkallu began. Education isn't just job training or credential acquisition. It's transmission of civilization itself from one generation to the next, maintaining the chain of knowledge that extends back to the very beginning. This perspective can transform how we view and value education. When teachers are underpaid, disrespected, their professional judgment overridden by politicians or administrators, we break faith with the tradition. When students are seen merely as future workers rather than as inheritors of civilization, we diminish education's purpose. The Mesopotamian scribes who studied for years to master cuneiform understood that they were doing something important, something sacred, becoming part of a lineage reaching back to Uana himself. Modern students deserve to understand their education similarly, as initiation into humanity's accumulated wisdom, as participation in something far larger than themselves. The Apkallu tradition also acknowledges that knowledge has divine dimensions, that pursuing understanding can be a spiritual practice. Modern secular societies tend to separate religion from learning, faith from scholarship, but ancient Mesopotamians saw them as inseparable. Understanding mathematics meant understanding divine order. Practicing medicine meant channeling divine healing power. Studying law meant implementing divine justice. All knowledge ultimately traced to the gods, mediated through the Apkallu, made available to humans who pursued wisdom seriously. We've lost some of this sacred dimension, but perhaps to our detriment. When learning becomes purely instrumental, just a means to economic ends, it loses much of its power to inspire and transform. When education is only about career preparation, it fails to address deeper human needs for meaning and purpose. The ancient view that wisdom itself is inherently valuable, that understanding is worth pursuing regardless of the immediate practical application, might serve us better than our current obsession with return on investment in education. The myth's treatment of mortality also remains powerful. Adapa, the wisest being who ever lived, still died. His wisdom didn't save him from death. This might seem tragic, but it also affirms something essential. Being human means being mortal, and that's not a bug to be fixed but a feature to be accepted. Our mortality gives life meaning, creates urgency, makes our choices significant. If we lived forever, nothing would matter. Because we die, everything matters. Modern transhumanists and life extension enthusiasts dream of defeating death through technology. Maybe they'll succeed, but the Adapa myth suggests caution. Even if we could become immortal, would we want to? Would we still be human? Or would we become something else, neither mortal nor truly divine, caught between categories like Adapa standing in Anu's heaven? The ancient wisdom suggests that perhaps some boundaries exist for good reasons, that some limitations define rather than diminish us. The Seven Sages myth also models cultural transmission across enormous time spans. From the alleged antediluvian period through thousands of years of copying and recopying, the tradition maintained a remarkable consistency. This demonstrates that cultural memory can span vast periods if communities care enough to preserve it. We tend to think in short time horizons, obsess over the immediate, forget the long view. But the Mesopotamians thought in terms of millennia, saw themselves as inheritors of ancient wisdom and transmitters to future generations. This long view matters for addressing issues like climate change, where actions today have consequences decades or centuries hence. It matters for preserving languages, cultures, traditions that might otherwise vanish. It matters for maintaining institutions, libraries, universities, museums that operate on century-long timescales. The Apkallu tradition embodies this long view, reminds us that human time extends beyond individual lifespans, encourages us to think about what we're creating and transmitting to those who come after. The archetypal nature of the story also deserves attention. Regardless of whether the seven sages literally existed, their story captures something true about how civilization developed. Humans did learn agriculture, did invent writing, did develop mathematics, did create law codes, did build cities. These developments weren't automatic or inevitable. They required intelligence, creativity, persistence, and the ability to pass learning across generations. The Apkallu myth honors these achievements, elevates them, suggests that the development of civilization was itself a kind of miracle, a transformation so profound it required explanation through divine intervention. Modern people sometimes take civilization for granted. We're born into a world with writing, mathematics, law, medicine, architecture. It seems natural, inevitable, but it isn't. Every bit of it was invented, developed, refined through countless generations of effort, and it remains fragile. Wars destroy knowledge, disasters obliterate infrastructure, cultural changes can disrupt transmission. Each generation must choose to maintain and develop what previous generations built. The Apkallu myth, in making civilization's foundation explicit and sacred, reminds us not to take it for granted. The sevenfold structure itself has psychological resonance. 7 is a memorable number, easy to hold in mind, neither too few to seem arbitrary nor too many to be unwieldy. 7 days in a week, 7 colors in a rainbow, 7 notes in the musical scale, 7 wonders of the ancient world, 7 liberal arts in medieval education. The tradition of 7 as a perfect or complete number runs through human culture. The 7 sages fit into this pattern, embody completeness, suggest that what they taught encompassed everything necessary. Finally, the story acknowledges that progress and loss go together. The antediluvian age, when the Apkallu walked the earth, was more connected to the divine than what followed. After the flood, wisdom had to be transmitted through human means, requiring effort and study rather than direct divine teaching. This movement from immediate presence to distant transmission, from revelation to tradition, from golden age to subsequent decline, appears in many cultural narratives. But the narrative doesn't end in despair. Yes, something was lost, but something crucial was preserved. The knowledge survived. Civilization continued. Humans proved capable of maintaining and developing what the Apkallu taught them. The transition from divine sages to human scholars wasn't just loss, but also maturation. Humans taking responsibility for their own civilization rather than depending on divine intervention. This message remains relevant. We face challenges our ancestors didn't. We've developed technologies that threaten our survival. We've created global interconnection that enables pandemics and economic crises to spread instantly. We've altered the climate itself. In some ways, we've surpassed the wisdom of the Apkallu, developed knowledge they never imagined. In other ways, we've perhaps fallen behind, lost touch with the sacred dimension of learning, forgotten the long view, prioritized short-term gain over long-term sustainability. The ancient myth doesn't provide answers to modern problems, but it provides perspective, reminds us that civilization is precious and fragile, that wisdom matters, that education is sacred transmission, that each generation faces the choice of whether to maintain and develop what was entrusted to them or to let it decay. The 7 sages taught the first humans. Now we must teach ourselves, and our children and our children's children, maintaining the chain that stretches back through millennia to those legendary beings who supposedly emerged from the cosmic waters bringing the gifts of civilization. And in doing so, we honor their memory and participate in the eternal work they began. Closing reflections. The night is getting late, and we've journeyed far together tonight through the deep history of Mesopotamia, through myths of fishmen emerging from primordial waters, through the sacred knowledge that supposedly founded civilization itself. The 7 sages, the Apkallu, whatever name we give them, represent something that transcends their specific cultural context. They embody humanity's attempt to understand and honor how we became more than just clever animals, how we developed language and writing and law and mathematics, and all the intricate web of knowledge that makes civilization possible. Whether these beings literally existed as the myths describe, whether there really were 7 semi-divine sages created by Enki and the Absu, matters less than what the story achieves. It tells us that wisdom is precious, that teaching is sacred, that civilization requires conscious maintenance, that each generation holds responsibility for preserving and transmitting knowledge to the next. That learning connects us to something ancient and profound, a chain of understanding reaching back thousands of years and extending forward into a future we can barely imagine. The tablets that tell these stories, inscribed in cuneiform by scribes who believed they were preserving essential truth, still speak across the millennia. The ruins of Eridu, where the first sage emerged, still stand in the Iraqi desert, silent now but bearing witness to what humans can achieve when they value wisdom. The tradition of the 7 sages, though originating in ancient Sumer, influenced countless later cultures, shaped how entire civilizations understood their own origins and nature. We stand at a different point in history than those ancient scribes. Our challenges differ from theirs. We have technologies they couldn't imagine, face problems they never encountered. But we share the same fundamental need for wisdom, the same requirement to maintain and transmit knowledge, the same responsibility to future generations. In that sense, we remain heirs to the Apkallu, participants in the work they supposedly began when they taught the first humans the arts of civilization. Modern education, modern libraries, modern universities, modern research institutions, all these continue the function the 7 sages performed. Every teacher explaining a complex concept, every student struggling to master difficult material, every scholar pushing the boundaries of knowledge, every librarian preserving and organizing information, participates in that ancient tradition. The forms change across millennia, but the essential work remains the same: maintaining, developing, and transmitting the wisdom that makes civilization possible. The story also reminds us that civilization is not a permanent achievement but an ongoing project. It can be lost, knowledge can be forgotten, the chain of transmission can break. History provides examples: the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations, the fall of Rome, the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, the burning of the Library of Nalanda, countless smaller catastrophes where accumulated wisdom vanished. Each time this happens, humanity must rebuild, relearn, rediscover. The cost of failure is measured in generations. So the ancient warning remains urgent. We must value wisdom. We must support education. We must maintain the institutions that preserve and transmit knowledge. We must see learning not just as economic credential, but as sacred inheritance and responsibility. We must think long-term, considering not just immediate needs, but what we're creating for those who come after. The myth of the 7 sages, told in a language now dead, about gods no longer worshipped in cultures that vanished millennia ago, still teaches these essential truths. And perhaps that longevity itself proves the myth's central point. Wisdom, if properly preserved and transmitted, can survive any catastrophe, any cultural change, any passage of time. The tablets crumbled, but the knowledge survived. The cities fell, but the tradition persisted. The civilization disappeared, but the story remained. We inherit that story now. What we do with it, whether we honor its message or ignore its warnings, will determine what future generations inherit from us. Will they look back at our time as a golden age when wisdom flourished and civilization advanced? Or will they see a missed opportunity, a generation that had knowledge but lacked wisdom, that had information but couldn't transform it into understanding? The choice, as always, is ours. The 7 sages, if they ever existed, cannot teach us now. We must teach ourselves and each other, maintaining and developing the traditions we've inherited, passing them forward improved if possible, but at minimum intact to the next generation. That work is hard, demanding, sometimes thankless, but it remains, as it was for the ancient Mesopotamians, the most important work there is, comparing wisdom traditions across cultures. The concept of primordial wisdom teachers appears in so many ancient cultures that it demands comparative analysis. Are these independent developments, human minds repeatedly arriving at similar solutions to similar questions? Or do they suggest actual historical connections, ideas spreading through trade and conquest across the ancient world? The truth likely involves both processes operating simultaneously, creating a complex web of influence and parallel development that scholars continue to unravel. Egyptian tradition, for instance, includes Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and magic. Thoth supposedly taught the Egyptians hieroglyphic writing, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. He served as scribe to the gods, recording cosmic events and divine decrees. His role parallels the Apkallu in many ways: divine origin, teaching foundational knowledge, association with writing and mathematics, connection to magic and healing. Whether Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions influenced each other, or whether both drew on even older shared sources from the pre-literate period, remains debated. The Egyptian concept of the followers of Horus, semi-divine beings who supposedly ruled Egypt before the historical pharaohs, provides another parallel. These beings bridge the gap between pure myth and historical record, much as the Apkallu mediated between divine wisdom and human learning. Both traditions posited a golden age, when the gods or their representatives directly guided humanity, followed by a decline into ordinary history, where humans must maintain civilization without direct divine intervention. Chinese mythology includes the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, legendary rulers from before historical records who taught civilization to the Chinese people. Fuqi invented writing, fishing and trapping. Shennong taught agriculture and herbalism. Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, established government, created the calendar, and promoted various arts and technologies. These figures, whether historical persons mythologized or purely legendary, served functions remarkably similar to the Apkallu, teaching essential knowledge, founding civilization, bridging divine and human realms. The Chinese tradition also included the concept of transmitted wisdom, with later sages explicitly connecting themselves to ancient sources of authority. Confucius positioned himself as transmitter rather than innovator, claiming merely to pass on ancient wisdom from the sage kings. This mirrors how Mesopotamian scribes saw themselves as heirs to the Apkallu, maintaining rather than inventing knowledge. Both traditions valued antiquity, saw older as better, believed that primordial wisdom surpassed contemporary innovation. Indian tradition with the 7 rishis provides perhaps the closest parallel to the Mesopotamian 7 sages. These ancient sages received the Vedas directly from the gods and transmitted them to humanity through perfect memorization and ritual recitation. The number 7, the role as teachers, the divine connection, all match up Kalu patterns. Some scholars argue for historical connections between Mesopotamian and Indian traditions, noting that the Indus Valley civilization maintained trade contacts with Sumer, potentially allowing myths and ideas to spread. Others see parallel development, arguing that early agricultural civilizations independently developed similar frameworks for understanding their own origins. The rishis remain important in Hindu tradition today, venerated as stars in the constellation Ursa Major, believed to watch over humanity perpetually. This astronomical connection mirrors Mesopotamian associations between divine beings and celestial bodies, suggesting another point of contact or parallel development. Both traditions saw the heavens as populated with divine or semi-divine beings, whose positions and movements carried meaning and influence. Persian tradition includes the concept of the Amesha Spentus, 7 divine beings emanating from Ahura Mazda, the supreme god in Zoroastrianism. These beings govern different aspects of reality: wisdom, righteousness, power, devotion, wholeness, immortality. While their function differs from the Apkallu, they serve as intermediaries between the supreme deity and human realm, channeling divine qualities into creation. The sevenfold structure again appears, suggesting either influence or archetypal pattern. Greek tradition's shift from mythological to historical sages is particularly interesting. Early Greek myths included divine teachers like Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and taught humans numerous crafts and technologies. But by the classical period, Greeks emphasized human sages, historical figures like Thales, Solon, and Pythagoras, who developed wisdom through reason and observation, rather than divine revelation. This transition from divine to human sources of wisdom parallels the Mesopotamian shift from Apkallu to Umanu, from semi-divine sages to human scholars. The Greek philosophical tradition maintained certain quasi-religious elements, even as it became more rational. Pythagoreans treated their founder as semi-divine, attributed miraculous abilities to him, and maintained secret wisdom traditions passed only to initiated students. Platonic thought included a theory of recollection, suggesting that learning was really remembering knowledge the soul possessed before birth. These ideas, while philosophically sophisticated, preserved something of the ancient pattern where wisdom came from transcendent sources rather than ordinary human invention. Jewish and later Christian traditions show clear Mesopotamian influence, while transforming the material significantly. The flood narrative in Genesis closely parallels Mesopotamian versions, though with monotheistic modifications. Abraham's origin in Ur connects Israelite tradition explicitly to Mesopotamian geography and possibly to cultural influences. The concept of wisdom as divine gift appears throughout biblical literature, from Solomon's legendary wisdom to the personification of wisdom in Proverbs as a feminine figure present at creation. The sevenfold pattern appears repeatedly in biblical texts: 7 days of creation, 7-branched menorah, 7 seals in Revelation, and numerous other examples. While these may be independent uses of a number that humans find naturally significant, they might also reflect cultural influence from Mesopotamian traditions, where 7 carried similar importance. The question of influence versus parallel development remains complex, unlikely to be answered definitively given the limitations of evidence. Islamic tradition also preserved and transformed ancient wisdom traditions. The Quran mentions mysterious figures like Khidr, the Green One, who possesses divine knowledge and appears to teach profound truths to prophets and seekers. Some Islamic scholars interpreted ancient sage traditions from pre-Islamic Arabia and surrounding regions through Quranic frameworks, creating synthesis between older and newer religious systems. Sufi mysticism developed elaborate teachings about the transmission of divine wisdom through chains of initiated masters, each student learning from a teacher who learned from their teacher, chains supposedly extending back to Muhammad himself or even to earlier prophets. This emphasis on transmitted wisdom, on unbroken lineages connecting contemporary seekers to primordial sources, mirrors both Mesopotamian scribal traditions and Hindu guru-student relationships, suggesting either widespread influence or universal patterns in how humans conceptualize sacred knowledge. When we step back and view these traditions comparatively, several patterns emerge. First, ancient cultures worldwide grappled with the question of how civilization began. The answer consistently involved supernatural teachers, divine figures or semi-divine sages who gave humans essential knowledge. Ordinary human invention rarely sufficed to explain the magnitude of the transformation from primitive to civilized existence. Second, the knowledge these teachers provided typically encompassed similar domains: agriculture, writing, mathematics, law, medicine, and religious ritual. These are genuinely the foundations of civilization, the minimum knowledge required to maintain complex societies. The consistency of these domains across cultures suggests they reflect real requirements for civilization rather than arbitrary choices. Third, many traditions emphasize the number 7 or similar sacred numbers like 3 or 5. This numerical pattern might reflect cognitive limits on how many distinct items humans can easily remember and conceptualize, making 7 a practical number for organizing lists. Or it might reflect astronomical observations, with 7 visible planets in ancient skies, creating associations between the number and cosmic completeness. Fourth, most traditions included a narrative of decline, a golden age when divine teachers walked among humans, followed by a lesser age when humans must maintain civilization on their own. This pattern might reflect genuine historical memories of earlier periods when priestly classes maintained closer contact with sacred mysteries, followed by secularization. Or it might express a universal human tendency toward nostalgia, believing that earlier times were better, purer, more connected to transcendent reality. Fifth, the traditions maintained remarkable longevity, persisting for centuries or millennia despite cultural changes, political upheavals, and technological transformations. This longevity demonstrates genuine cultural importance, not just entertaining stories, but foundational myths that help societies understand their own nature and purpose. The comparative approach also reveals unique aspects of the Mesopotamian Apkallu tradition. The fishman imagery is distinctive, though water-associated divine beings appear in many cultures. The explicit connection to Enki and the Abzu, to cosmic waters as source of wisdom and life, reflects Mesopotamian environmental realities. A civilization dependent on irrigation, where water literally meant survival, would naturally see water symbolism as central to wisdom traditions. The transition from Apkallu to Umanu, from divine to human wise men, receives more explicit attention in Mesopotamian sources than in most other traditions. The flood as dividing line, the banishment of the sages, the continuation through partly divine then fully human scholars, all this is carefully worked out in Mesopotamian texts. Other traditions often have vaguer transitions, or none at all, suggesting the Mesopotamians thought particularly hard about how divine knowledge becomes human heritage. The integration with kingship also seems distinctively Mesopotamian. The Uruk lists pairing of each sage with a king established wisdom and political power as necessarily joined, each requiring the other. This pattern influenced how Mesopotamian kings understood their own role and authority, seeing themselves as not just warriors and administrators, but as wise rulers connected to ancient traditions. Other cultures developed different relationships between religious authority and political power, sometimes separating them more sharply than Mesopotamia did. When considering whether these traditions are connected historically or represent parallel development, the answer is probably both, in complex ways. Human cultures don't develop in isolation. Trade, conquest, migration, and cultural exchange mean ideas spread. The Mesopotamian Apkallu tradition certainly influenced Greek, Jewish, and possibly Indian traditions. But the underlying pattern, primordial teachers who revealed civilization's secrets, might be independently invented multiple times because it addresses universal human concerns about origins and identity. This combination of diffusion and parallel development makes untangling specific influences difficult. When Greek sources describe Oannes emerging from the sea to teach wisdom, we can confidently say they borrowed from Mesopotamia, because the details match too closely for coincidence. But when Chinese sources describe ancient sage kings teaching civilization, determining whether this reflects Mesopotamian influence through the Silk Road or independent invention becomes much harder. Both possibilities remain plausible, and the truth might involve complicated historical processes we can never fully reconstruct given available evidence. What matters more than proving specific connections is recognizing the universal pattern and what it reveals about human nature and civilization. Across cultures, Across millennia, humans have told similar stories about how they learned to be civilized. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're attempts to understand who we are, where we came from, what makes us different from other animals, what we owe to previous generations, and what we owe to those who come after. The Mesopotamian seven sages represent one particular cultural expression of this universal pattern. They're distinctive in their fishman imagery, in their explicit sevenfold organization, in their connection to specific historical traditions like the Uruk list. But they're also archetypal, embodying something larger than their specific cultural context, speaking to concerns and questions that transcend ancient Mesopotamia to address fundamental human issues. Modern people, products of scientific worldviews that emphasize material causes and human agency, might dismiss these wisdom teacher myths as primitive misunderstandings, pre-scientific attempts to explain what we now understand through evolution, cultural development, and technological innovation. But this dismissal misses something important. The myths aren't trying to be scientific explanations. They're trying to encode values, to establish frameworks for understanding civilization's meaning and purpose, to create narratives that guide behavior and transmit culture. When ancient Mesopotamians told stories about the seven sages, they weren't just explaining how writing was invented. They were saying that writing is sacred, that literacy connects you to divine wisdom, that education is initiation into ancient mysteries, that scribes are heirs to primordial teachers. These ideas shaped how Mesopotamian society valued education, how it trained scribes, how it preserved and transmitted knowledge. The myth's truth wasn't historical accuracy, but functional effectiveness, how well it accomplished its cultural work. The same applies to other wisdom teacher traditions. They encode cultural values, establish frameworks for understanding civilization, create narratives guiding behavior. Whether the seven rishis literally existed matters less than what believing in them accomplishes, valuing the Vedas, respecting traditional knowledge, seeing spiritual wisdom as humanity's highest achievement. Whether Thoth literally invented hieroglyphs matters less than the Egyptian conviction that writing was sacred, that scribes served the gods, that preserving knowledge was religious duty. So when we compare these traditions across cultures, we're not just cataloguing similarities and differences, we're recognizing a fundamental human pattern, a deep structure in how societies think about knowledge, wisdom, education, and cultural transmission. The seven sages and their equivalents in other cultures represent humanity's attempt to make civilization sacred, to see our achievements as more than just clever survival strategies, to connect our learning to transcendent sources that give it meaning and purpose. This pattern remains relevant today. We still need narratives that make education meaningful, that value wisdom, that see teaching as sacred work, that connect contemporary efforts to ancient traditions. The specific forms change, science replaces divine revelation as knowledge source, but the underlying need persists to make civilization matter, to give learning purpose, to honor those who transmit knowledge across generations. The seven sages, whether Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, or their equivalents in countless other cultures, serve this eternal function. They remind us that civilization is precious, that knowledge is sacred, that education matters, that each generation holds responsibility for maintaining and developing what previous generations built. These lessons transcend any particular cultural expression, remaining vital as long as humans live in complex societies requiring transmitted knowledge to function. So tonight, as we close this exploration of these ancient tablets and the wisdom they preserve, take a moment to think about what you've learned recently, what wisdom you've gained, what understanding has deepened. Think about who taught you, who invested time and energy in your education, who passed knowledge to you. And think about who you might teach, what you might pass forward, how you might participate in the eternal work of maintaining and transmitting civilization. The seven sages emerged from the Abzu 5,000 years ago, according to myth. They taught humanity everything needed to build civilization. Then the flood came and they were sent back to the cosmic waters. But their work didn't end. It continues every time anyone learns something new, every time anyone teaches something important, every time anyone chooses wisdom over ignorance, understanding over confusion, knowledge over darkness. That work continues now, in you, in everyone who watched this video, in everyone who seeks to understand rather than merely to know. The Apkallu would be pleased, I think, to see their mission continuing so many millennia later, carried forward by countless teachers and students who probably never heard their names, but who nonetheless embody their values and continue their work. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. If you enjoyed this exploration of ancient wisdom and the mystery of the 7 sages, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with others who might appreciate these deep dives into history's most fascinating stories. Let me know in the comments what aspects of this topic interested you most, or what other ancient mysteries you'd like to explore in future videos. Until next time, value wisdom, honor knowledge, and never stop learning. The 7 sages taught us well. Good night.